next member to speak is Deputy Luce.
Thank you, sir. And I'd like to just start by saying to the Assembly that I'm committed to this process, and they may remember some that I was in the Minister's position between 2014 and 2018. And the 2018 law that we've referred to a couple of times came to this Assembly quite shortly after the previous Environment Minister had taken office, and a lot of that was rooted in my ministry that started then. So I use that only as an example to show to members that I am committed to this process and eliminating bad landlords and bad properties that don't meet minimum standards. I've seen the evidence, I've seen the photographs. They don't make pretty reading, and how people can live in some of these properties is quite frankly beyond me. But sir, I've been a landlord and a tenant, and I was fortunate enough to be a tenant for a very, very good landlord for 20 plus years. But my experience of being a landlord myself was mixed. I was fortunate enough to purchase a very small bungalow in my 20s. I lived in it for a while and then rented it out, and I rented it out completely refurbished, and my first tenant after 6 months left and left the property in such a condition it needed to be completely refurbished again. I was then fortunate enough to take on another tenant who lasted 20 plus years, and I didn't give me a moment's problem. And I use those examples, sir, just to say that on both sides of this there are good and bad, and invariably they're good. And we need here to find the best compromise we can, how we best target those dwellings that are not good enough and not up to standards. So I absolutely agree with the principles of what we're trying to achieve here, but I want members to know that my panel, scrutiny panel, are minded and have agreed to call this in at the end of this debate if these principles are approved. And I'm just going to say very briefly why, because I'm not going to speak for very much longer. We just feel that we need to consult with the wider landlord community. Those are people who mainly own fewer numbers of properties, single properties or two properties. We want to look at red tape and find out whether it's the Minister or others that may be correct in their views. We want to look at the cap that may or may not exist on fees, and I hear what the Ministers had to say this morning. We'll need to verify that. We want to look at the code of practice and see if we can find out some more detail about it, because it's not yet available for us to scrutinise. And we want to look at, and has been mentioned, the potential combined effect of this proposition with the Housing Minister's white paper and some policies in the island plan that talk about carbon and insulation, building bylaws being upgraded, and also the energy performance certificates. So there's a number of issues that my panel want to look at, but be assured I will be voting in favour of these principles, and if they are accepted, we will look closer at them before coming back to the Assembly. Thank you, sir.
Thank you, Deputy. Deputy Scott.
Thank you, sir. Just to remind you, sir, that I'm awaiting an answer from the Attorney-General to the question that I asked, whether the law allows random searches.
You want that answer now?
Yes, please.
Yes.
So the 2018 law sets out the powers of investigation in Article 6, and the conditions for the power of investigation to be exercised are simply, well, there has to be a rented dwelling to start with, but then secondly, there has to be production, if required, of evidence of the authorised person's authority. So the authorised person will be one of the Minister's officers. And then the third requirement is simply reasonable time and upon notice to the occupiers of the rented dwelling. And Article 6.3 goes on to prescribe a minimum of 24 hours notice, except in cases of emergency or a couple of other minor exceptions, which I don't need to repeat. So subject to those three requirements, the powers of investigation of one of the Minister's officers can be exercised. So if that, provided those conditions are satisfied, then a random check can be made, but subject to those three conditions, assuming that these regulations are approved.
Sorry, can I just, so there is no power without these regulations being approved? It's necessary because I
Well,
thought...
no, you stupid woman.
Hello? Sorry. Seems to be an opinion on me. Anyway, I'm trying to establish whether under the law as currently drafted, there is that right to have random investigations, random checks. Thanks.
Yes, Mr. Tony.
So yes, the law sets out that power of investigation. So I've already said that the conditions are simply reasonable notice, production, if required, of evidence of the authorised person's authority. So yes, there is a power to make random checks. Thank you, sir.
Thank you, Mr. Tony. Do you want to address the Assembly now, Deputy Scott? Do you want to make a speech now?
Oh, yes, if it's my turn, sir. Thank you.
It is your turn, yes.
Thank you. So I asked the question because I just wanted to be clear exactly what when I was listening to the Minister explaining his rationale for bringing these regulations, the proposed regulations, and his objective, whether it seems the right way to be going about things, because I totally accept that the rights under the law that actually give him powers and his officers powers to inspect properties and to enforce these minimum standards should be enforced. But it does seem that they can be enforced regardless of whether these regulations are passed or not. So, I have difficulty in understanding or even accepting the rationale for bringing these regulations in this way. Because it seems to me, and it's nothing new, unfortunately, when it comes to the Department for the Environment, that we are talking about enforcement, or lack of it, which, of course, we have come in different areas of planning. But here we go. We're learning that if it really comes down to this, the real motivation seems to be to come up with a way of extracting fees from an area of the population, saying, well, this is because we're regulating you. It's a stealth tax. And in actually imposing that stealth tax, we're not really kind of like getting any guarantee that the enforcement will be better. We're just being told, oh, it's going to be better because when you're going to pass these regulations, it's going to make it better. Well, I'm sorry, I actually think it should be better right now. And in the meantime, you've got officers who are going to end up being given a job to collect all these forms, produce these licenses or this kind of blanket license to all these landlords, when we already know that landlords have to provide information in order to register their businesses, which is why I've actually asked so much about, well, why would you have licensing as opposed to registration? Well, I feel I know the answer. It's so you can actually charge some fees. And you need to actually really understand what that means, not just for the market in terms of the rental market, but also in terms of the costs of actually housing and these things. There is a systematic issue here. And I don't really feel that the risk assessment in terms of how that's going to impact on people's accommodation, and how that may, in fact, impact on a market, on a sector who are, in an ideal world, wouldn't even perhaps be there, because a lot of the time they're just compensating for the fact that government's not providing enough social housing. And this is a government, where the Chief Minister, who happens to be in Rwanda, actually has been on record for saying, and criticising a former Chief Minister about a lack of joined-up thinking. Let's go on about this lack of joined-up thinking. Let's compare the regime that's being set out here with the regime by which lodging houses are registered, because they are exempt from these regulations. Well, now, what happens with lodging houses? They happen to be registered.
Will the Deputy take a point of information?
I believe the Minister has a chance to pick things up in his speech. So,
Yes.
So the lodging houses have to, and rather peculiarly, the law there, who's the Minister responsible for lodging houses? Oh, it's the Minister for Housing and Communities. So what I see is we've already got a structure that actually supports siloism, and it's being evolved even more, rather than perhaps, well, I do believe the Minister for Housing was originally looking at in respect of other areas of rental regulation, rather than government just stepping back and saying, what's a really good, systematic, effective way of ensuring that tenancies are properly regulated and, well, stealth tax or not, but let's even compare the actual cost of the fees of registering under the lodging houses registration Jersey law compared to what's being offered here. Oh, we're told it's just such a small amount. Well, why is it different from the cost of registering under the lodging houses law? Somebody going to explain that to me? It's actually, from what I understand, it's £15.08 per lodger for lodging houses. But here you can have one person in a single studio flat, and the actual licence fee would be £60, finally, 30. So twice as much. Something about the cost of increase in cost of living. I really don't know. I'm sorry, it does seem to me to be a stealth tax. Justifying, or actually saying, well, it costs less to run this department that already has a responsibility for enforcing standards and can do random checks. And let's look at these standard licence conditions, because that's meant to give us the assurance that these minimum safety standards will be enforced. They're already in the law. If you look at the standard licence condition number 1, the licence holder must ensure that the rented dwelling complies with the minimum safety standards whenever it is used as rented dwelling. Look at the definition, and it just refers to the law. I mean, this reminds me of this joke I once heard about somebody went into a pet shop and wanted to buy a bird that could speak. I think it's parrot. Said to the pet shop owner, does it speak? Oh, yes, it speaks. And he takes it home, and it doesn't speak. So he goes back to the pet shop owner and says it doesn't speak. Pet shop owner says it needs a mirror, and then it will look in the mirror and then it speaks. It doesn't. He goes back again. Oh, it needs a ramp. It goes up a ramp and look in the mirror, it will speak. And then, no, it doesn't. And then he's actually told he needs a bell. If he needs to run up the ramp, look at the mirror and ring the bell, and then he will speak. Well, he brought the bell on top of the ramp, and of course the mirror. And then he went back to the pet shop and said, parrot's dead. It's not Monty Python's sketch. And the pet shop owner said, but did the parrot speak? And he said, yes. He said, doesn't that pet shop sell any birdseed? So I remain somewhat perplexed at this as a solution to a problem that of which the law, because at some point in their wisdom, the States Assembly thought there was a problem, let's solve it by passing this law. And they did. And yet we're not really seeing the thing. It's rather like, you know, there was that law about, had a rental tribunal, and we had all this effort to bring in another rental, and then suddenly somebody said, oh, look, there's already a law for rental tribunal. I mean, this is a mess. This is a dog's dinner. Consequences. There's no substitute for social housing being enough and setting the standard. And this stuff about removal of licences and negotiation tactic, well, Deputy Ballot has been down that route. You know, I mean, if you're going to threaten notices, you can threaten criminal charges because the law already has that framework. And what I find so disappointing, given what we've already seen in terms of a kind of approach where I've already seen the rights of the Assembly eroded in terms of now we get ministerial policy being made under the planning law without States Assembly approval, although apparently it's not policy, there's a bit of an argument about that. But a tree order that actually got put out there and caused a whole load of people to cut down trees. I'm going to say, hey, I'm not convinced that this is really the right way to tread. This is clearly inflammatory. Bring in licences when already landlords are actually registering, and the law gives all these powers. So I'm not convinced. I'm really disappointed to hear like terms when people talk about landlords, and that they actually point out these things and they say, oh, you know, they're vested interests. Well, thank goodness you're not bringing back witchcraft, because, you know, trials of witchcraft, because I'm a woman, I'll have a vested interest. I mean, this is just, and people talking about landlords being a baying mob. I mean, I'm sorry, this is incredibly divisive and inflammatory way of going about things. And I would prefer that the Minister talk to his officers about looking into how landlords already are registered, how that information is collected, how that can actually already form the basis of a register, and really just look at filling any gaps if there are any, and not bring in essentially a stealth tax saying, well, we're not going to employ any more people, but hey, you know, good landlords need to pay for bad landlords. I mean, our next thing, I guess, I mean, I suppose I do in text, but how about specific, I need to have a licence because I'm not in prison. Because I need to pay for people who are in prison. You know, we could raise loads of money this way. So as I say, sir, I remain perplexed by this. I believe that there is a better way, but unfortunately, the Chief Minister's not here to tell me that. Thank you.
Thank you, Deputy Scott. Deputy Shern, your light was on briefly. Did you want to speak? No? Deputy Tadia.
Thank you. That's good timing. I feel inspired after that. That's the best that the against lot can put forward. I'm not sure if there was a cohesive argument in there at all, but it has given me food for thought, and it's certainly given me a good segue into a point I was going to make, sir. So first of all, let's deal with Deputy Balash's comments. So we know what the position is of the Liberal Conservatives, the 2.5 members that they've got in the Assembly. I think we've just possibly heard from their third member who's got an application in the post. basically goes back to the basically went back to the we don't want it and don't like it argument. I think that we heard the other day. Except it's got the added benefit of having a parrot in it. And it did seem that some of the arguments that we heard were being parroted and being repeated. And of course, a lot of the arguments have been, I think, copied and pasted several times over the internet over the last few weeks. And that's good. It's good to see lobbying and arguments put forward, some of which are perhaps more valid than others. So I remember Deputy Balash probably in a different debate talking about donner et retenir ne vaut, and this is to do with trust law, I think. And it seems to me that we hear time and time again the argument that some landlords, because I think most landlords know full well what they're doing. I don't want to lecture anyone about it. We've probably got landlords in the gallery who've been doing it for years and I'm sure want to be very effective in what they're doing. But we hear the arguments about, oh, well, you know, there are bad tenants as well. And no doubt there are. Let's take it away from properties or accommodation or homes that people live in. Because I think underlying this, there's an element about the human right, which is the peaceful enjoyment of one's property. And of course, I would say that something fundamentally changes when you rent out your property, is that at least to a certain extent, it stops being yours partially for the time which is rented out. You can't have it both ways. If you want to live in a property that you own, you can do that. As soon as you rent it out, you accept that it's somebody else's home for a period which could be a year, 5 years, or maybe decades. And that's why I go back to the idea of donner et retenir ne vaut. You can't both give and retain. It's a bit like saying in more vernacular terms, you can't have your cake and eat it. And if you think about a car, you could have a conversation that went like this. You never guess what, I rented out my car and the car came back and the person had only gone and put 500 miles on the clock. And oh, that's terrible. Yeah, and the clutch was worn out. The clutch wasn't like that when I left it out. And I also needed to fix the windscreen wipers. That's terrible. What, your car? Yeah, my car. How could they do that to you? I presume you took a deposit. Oh, yeah, I did, and I took it out of the deposit. But still, that's not the point. Yeah, you worked hard for that car. Well, no, to be fair, I inherited it off my parents, or it was a present. But oh, yeah, but nonetheless, it's still your car. And that's the argument we kind of hear with properties, isn't it? With homes that are being let out. And some people have no doubt worked very hard for their homes that they rent out. But it's kind of irrelevant. It's kind of irrelevant. They may have also inherited swathes of land and properties going back to the feudal period in Jersey, which we know doesn't have any inheritance law. And they may have been renting out properties without having to do a day's real work in their lives. But I'm sure that's not the case for most landlords. So we shouldn't fixate on those kind of arguments. Now, let's turn to the pet shop, shall we? Because the pet shop did get me thinking. We have, it reminded me of probably my favourite Pink Panther movie, which is The Pink Panther Strikes Back. So moving from the parrot to the dog, and Clouseau, I think, is in Switzerland trying to find Dreyfus, who's locked up in his castle, and he's gradually going mad, and I think we're starting to know what that feels like. After only 2 days of debate. Good luck for the rest of the week. And Clouseau says, do you have a Röhm? And the Munich hotel clerk, which is what it says here, says, I do not know what a Röhm is. And Inspector Clouseau, he checks the translation book and he says, Zimmer, like that. That's starting to feel a little bit Monty Python, isn't it? Like the Hungarian handbook. And he says, oh, a room, but with a Swiss accent. Hochdeutsch, no doubt. That is what I've been saying, you idiot, a Röhm. And then he sees the dog on the floor and he says, we all know this one, it's an old joke but put into slapstick by Sellers. Does your dog bite? No. Clouseau bends down to pet the small dog. It immediately growls and bites him. And Clouseau says, I thought you said your dog did not bite. And the answer is, that is not my dog. And guess what? In Jersey, you need a license to have a dog. I know it because I've had to register my dog in more than one parish over the years. And we don't get a letter from the Jersey Kennel Club, if such a thing exists, saying, you know what, that's just going to put the price of dog ownership up. Because I'm a breeder. I'm not, but the hypothetical person is saying I'm a breeder. And I'm going to have to pass that on to my client. So when they buy one of my litter, I'm going to have to charge them an extra tenner or whatever it is. You don't hear them writing letters about that. Maybe they would if we didn't have a licensing system for dogs. Maybe they'd be inundating us with those kind of letters. But we don't. Also, I found the position of the Liberal Conservative Party, if it is an official position, we've only heard from 50% of the party today. We need to find out that they're saying, oh, but don't worry, we are in favour of a register. Well, I would say to them they're 9 years too late, because I brought that proposition in 2014, and it was adopted by majority by the Assembly, including the Minister, who amended it. Interestingly, I asked for it to be put by the Housing Minister, and it was amended to the Health Minister. So let's add another minister into the mix there. I'm not so fussed about which minister ends up bringing this forward or which minister ends up enforcing this, because I see the Council of Ministers as a collective. And of course, there is an argument later on about whether it should all be under the Housing Minister, and we can have that. But I think let's not run before we can walk. And the point is, a register and a licensing system are not mutually exclusive. Let me give you some examples. So we have that register of dog owners. We know that there's a list which is presumably kept by each parish hall, and it might be centralised as well. There's an FOI request which I know about, and we know how many dog owners there are that are licensed in Jersey. We don't know about the ones that aren't licensed, so they're the only ones that we can enforce. So if a dog goes missing and bites somebody, whether it be in a Swiss hotel or on a beach in St. Juan, we can then look at the collar and say, oh, this is your dog, you've got a licence, and maybe we're going to fine you, maybe we're going to take your licence off you. So we've got a register and we've got a licensing system. There's a register of hotels, and guess what? You need to have a licence to run a hotel. Who'd have thought of that? That's got to put the pricing of hotels up, hasn't it? Presume they have to pass that on to the tourists or the business visitors. You have to register and have a licence to run a restaurant. Why don't we just wait for... Why are we demonising restaurant owners? Somebody's worked hard to go to Highlands College to learn to do their chefing or their sous chefing, but we demonise them by saying you've got to get a licence. Why don't we just wait for the bad restaurant owners to poison people and then say, actually, you shouldn't wait for complaints to come into environmental health and then say, yeah, you know what, maybe you shouldn't be doing this. We don't do that because that's a silly way to do it, because harm will have been created to those people. And I say it's exactly the same argument that Deputy Renniff, as Minister here, has been putting forward for safeguarding people. And of course, I think we've also got to get over this dichotomy of good, bad tenants, good, bad landlords, and actually look at the properties, because you can have a perfectly good landlord who's got, for whatever reason, a bad property. He or she might have inherited a property, doesn't really know what to do with it, got not much choice but to put it on the market. And you could have a morally indifferent landlord who's got a whole swathe of excellent properties. And so I think the good and bad of the ethics don't really come into it. And that's why the idea about licensing the premises is also a laudable one. Do I need to go through taxi drivers, PSV licence holders? There's a register of taxi drivers. There isn't a register of Jersey lifts, by the way. I'll just put that on the record now, because there might be some taxi drivers listening. But the point is, we need to know that there's a minimum standard of safety and of expectation that when you go into a taxi, both parties know what's expected of them. And taxi drivers may complain about a lot of things, but they certainly, I don't think they complain about having to be registered. In fact, they actually say, we like being registered, and we would like the Minister for Transport, for DFI, to actually licence all taxi drivers and not allow Jersey lifts to keep on operating. I'll just leave that there. So I didn't get what this argument was about a stealth tax. I don't see this as a stealth tax. I mean, successive governments have been very good at producing stealth tax, in my opinion. We could look at them and we could list them. But this isn't a stealth tax. I mean, this would probably, I doubt, even pay for the administration. It's hopefully a break-even scheme. So I don't see this as a stealth tax at all. And lastly, I know Deputy Mezek has said this argument in the past. One of the arguments we've been getting is that I'll sell up. I'm a landlord. I currently, 70% of the membership, apparently, of the Jersey Landlord Association have considered selling up and leaving the market. And I don't wish to sound glib. As I've said before, my wife is a landlord. And my answer to that is just two words. It's so what? We don't listen to this special pleading from the restaurateurs or the taxi drivers if they say, you know, I'm going to consider leaving the industry if you regulate me. They're already regulated and they work within that regulatory framework. And presumably, if you sell your properties or your property, you have to sell it, I'm guessing, to one of two types of people. You sell it to somebody who's going to become a home occupier, so an owner-occupier who will live in that home. Guess what that does? That's one less home you need to build. Have we got a shortage of homes at the moment for people who want to own and buy their own homes? Yes, we do. The Housing Minister wants to build, how many, 1,000 units possibly? If he could build 1,000 units in the next year, I'm sure he'd love to do it. So every landlord who sells up to somebody who buys their own home to live in it is positive. But of course, I'm not suggesting that would happen anyway. And if they just sell to another speculative landlord, then there's no change. It goes from one landlord to another landlord, but it goes to a landlord who will be willing to operate under a regulatory framework. And of course, it's up to the landlords what they do. They can sell their properties, but they have to also be aware of the current market conditions. So I'll leave that one there. So those are really the only points I wanted to make. It's probably longer than it might have needed to be, but because we've got a 15-minute limit, I will leave it there simply to say that it's nice to see the 15-minute limit working. It's a hard 15-minute deadline, and I know that it's perhaps slightly perversely gratifying to see people who would have probably voted for the 15 minutes were they in the Assembly being also caught out by the 15-minute rule. Thank you, sir.
Thank you, Deputy. Deputy Alex Curtis.
Thank you, sir. It's always hard following Deputy Taddier. You know, you can never get the jokes in the same way he does, but I will try to be short and brief and be well within my 15 minutes. I will at this point redeclare I am a landlord of one unit, and I would like to clarify to Deputy Scott. I heard the mention that the use of a licence and not a registration was as a stealth tax, as a way to collect money. And then 2 sentences later, we heard that lodging houses were registered, not licensed, and they collect fees. So I do see that if we're debating registration and licensing, the government has a precedent of applying fees on both. And I would like to make that point. We've all received significant representation on this, many opposing this. But a few points I'll add to this. We've heard about, by people contacting us, the availability of data and the ability to use our existing systems. I don't like standing up in the Assembly and saying our data is not what it should be. But in this instance, I will say our data is not what it should be. Whilst maintaining the correct data control and compliance laws, we can't go to My Deposits, or we don't at the moment, who hold perhaps one of the best stocks of data here. We don't go to the parishes. My ask on this comment is to the Minister to ensure he works across government to ensure that when we are delivering a better platform for data, we are doing so in a way that reduces red tape, uses processes of automation to reduce form filling. The best form is one you don't have to fill because it's self-automated, and brings back trust to islanders by getting data in their hands that they own. On the topic of a registration versus a licence, the Minister may not remember, during one Council of Ministers, I asked him quietly, I said, do we need a licence scheme? You know, I hate red tape, I hate bureaucracy. Do we need this? I said, I feel a system of record where we have landlords and tenants submitting photos in lieu of inspections, and then we could prove anonymity and do inspections. But the point the Minister made, and he's made well in his speech earlier, was that a licence is a permission to act. It allows you to regulate an industry without requiring the pursuit of kind of more draconian measures. And if done properly, it won't be bureaucratic, and it could save time and minimise cost, reducing the requirement of lengthy and expensive court cases. On this topic of bureaucracy, I've thought long and hard about this, and whether licences impact this. Could it be handled by registration? And I think the Minister's given a good argument. But I think, unfortunately, Deputy Taddier has stolen my thunder in thinking about the wider regulatory landscape of Jersey and where we might look at other things. The Assembly may remember we approved a new food licensing law. This is replacing an old, outdated, 1967, I believe, although I could be corrected, food registration law. Let's walk through the process that would have happened. In the past, a business who wished to produce food on premise, either for sale off the premise or on the premise, would register with the department by submitting a form. and the department will inspect, if required, at some point the premise. Under the new proposed form that the principles are agreed, I expect what will happen is a business will submit a form to the department and they will inspect if it is required. The difference is now that the department will be able to positively work with food producers to better regulate the environment. This works on a basis of trust that we're putting in the Minister that he will bring forward the right regulatory regime and not one that is zealous or overly administrative. Looking beyond this, we can think of other licences. As a business owner, I hold various licences. I hold a liquor licence, I hold a customs and excise production licence, and in the case of the latter, the Customs Department email me every year. They're very polite. They say, would you like a licence for next year? I say, oh, that would be lovely. They go, brilliant. Here it is. They don't charge me in that case, and I'm going to plead to the Minister not to introduce user pays charging there, and I shouldn't have mentioned it. But it's that simple. I say, I would like a licence. I would like to continue trading and producing. And they go, yeah, that's great. We have a licence. We can remove it if we need to in future, but you can keep trading. My liquor licence used to require me to submit a paper form. And you go, gosh, you've got this information. Now that's digital. I get an email from the regulations manager for licensing. I get a reminder when I forget and they say, you really don't want to pay the late fee. And I submit the form, I make the payment. The value of these licenses in both cases is because I'm performing an activity that it is valid, conditions could be attached to. We can think about all sorts of licenses that have value in this case. Driving licenses. We don't want a register of drivers who then we have to take more punitive, or trickier measures through. Gun licenses. I'm sure the connotabs who approve gun permits would prefer a process in which we can validate and check where required and remove a license rather than a gun registry. And on this concept, I go back to Deputy Balash, considering that a dwelling licence may be an infringement on liberty. And I would ask, in the same instances with a gun licence or the Department of Infrastructure, a waste management licence, are these infringements of liberty, or are they part of the social contract that individuals and businesses make with society in which to operate? The ask we all must have to the Minister, and give trust in him, like many of us did in the Minister for Infrastructure earlier, is to bring forward the correct licensing scheme. For those still doubting this and worried about red tape, I will pose a thought experiment along the lines of my customs licence. If government had all the data on rented properties it required already, if it enacted a licensing regime with no charge, and one day a licence appears through the postbox or by email to you, and it says, here's your licence, it'll auto-renew, you'll never touch it, it's there to allow you to trade, but it gives us a set of permission to act. Who could still make the point about bureaucracy and red tape within the system in opposition to a licence? It's a scale of how we implement this that will be the bureaucracy. And I repeat, licences do not have to be bureaucratic. I remain concerned there is a scope for bureaucracy, but we are debating, I believe, the principles of this part of the licensing law. I pay £114 for my 6th category liquor licence, and to me that's a significantly more substantial licence. It's quite significant. There are far fewer. So I still question the £30 per year that should be charged. I think it would be fair, given 20,000 properties roughly, I think, are rented on Ireland, that this is considered a cost government should embed in business as usual. And that actually I might consider this in future. This would avoid scope creep, and realistically it's something the whole island pays because half the island uses. And I will consider whether, in the future, a proposition to that effect is needed. I am concerned, as others have said, about the ongoing risk of bureaucracy by other legislation. But this is not the place we're dealing with this. Scrutiny have said they will call that in, and I myself will make sure that I stand strong against bureaucracy from the wider legislative landscape of housing. So, sir, a licence can be as simple as a row in a database, updated automatically or by simple confirmation. It can also be highly bureaucratic, with great administration cost and red tape. I would not support the latter, but I and the team of modernisation and digital will support the Minister in the delivery of a new approach that meets the need of the island without undue red tape.
Thank you, Deputy. Deputy Rob Ward.
Thank you, sir. Pleased to follow that. A sort of sense of deja vu for me here, because we've been here before and we agreed to principles before. And I have to say, and I'm a great exponent of scrutiny, I'm slightly disappointed that taking this in to the regulations to scrutiny again, because I hope what happened last time doesn't happen again, where the regulations came back and lost by 1 vote. And I will note that both the Chief Minister and the Deputy Chief Minister voted against and are not here today, and it had missed their chance to change their view. But I hope we are successful today. We all received a lot of emails, the same email, regards, and that's lobbying, that's fair enough, regards some of the issues. And I think most of them have been dealt with in terms of bureaucracy and red tape and so on. But I have to go back to the point that was made by the Minister regards what this actually means, what this actually entails to have a licence. To rent a home, and let's call them homes because that's what they are, so they're people's homes, they live in them, they spend their days in them and their evenings, and they sleep in them, and they're safe places, and they're places where you bring up children, you have relationships and you have friends and you live your life. That's what we're talking about here, sir. And they have to be of a certain standard. And those laws already exist in the rental dwellings law, and they are minimum standards. And I think it's a real key point here. We have a law that gives a minimum standard. Now, the argument is, well, why are we demonising landlords? This is not demonising landlords. This is doing exactly the opposite. It is saying to landlords who reach those minimum standards that you should not have to be in the same arena as those people who do not reach those standards. But by licensing, this gives actual real-time information on who owns and who rents out these homes, so that with targeted informed inspection, we can raise the standard of the lowest standard homes on this island. That's what this is about. And as to say, well, sir, we can randomly target without knowing where things are, that's extremely random. I really don't get the concept of how we do that without knowing who owns what and who is renting what. And all that's being asked, and I will say, sir, that when this was accepted before, there was no charge. But the argument was still that we don't want this. So the charge is not the issue. I genuinely believe, sir, that's a red herring. A £30 charge is minimal, and the point has been made a number of times that it's actually less than the fee to join the Jersey Landlords Association, which I believe is £35 a year. So perhaps in order to enable people to do that, cut your fees to £5 and everyone's better off. However, this is also, you can put it against your tax, so it's a negligible amount. Now, given the amount that people are paying for rental, which is extremely high on this island, that £30 is negligible and should not have an effect there. So let's deal with that red herring as well. We cannot continually build up, and we do it a lot in this assembly, sir, we build up tiny little pieces of straw. Let's call them that. I know where I'm going with this now. We build up tiny little pieces of straw, you may be guessing, and we turn them into a straw person. And we attack that, and it's not real. And then the debate becomes around those pieces of straw built together into something to form, and we end up not looking at the issue itself. And so the issue is simple. We have an issue with some standards of our homes. We cannot deal with that issue as effectively as we could unless we know who they are, where they are, and they are licensed. We license, and so many speakers have already talked about how we license everything else. I do not want to go to a cafe or a restaurant without a license because I have no idea that they are reaching the standards that they should reach. And they are inspected to ensure they reach those standards. It's a safety net for us in a modern society. Not a Victorian society, a modern society where we all have rights and standards that we want to reach, particularly in our homes. And so one of the things about licensing, and I think we are now ready for this. We are ready for this now because we are seeing with the housing issues that everybody faces and the costs of housing on this island, that you cannot just have a sector of our economy that involves so much money without having, and this is very light touch regulation. And so I have to say that the conflating of this with other areas of housing law does not help anybody. And these are, again, pieces of straw that are being put together to turn into a whole. It's like gestalt distraction. You put these things together and some of it is greater than the sum of its parts, and everyone gets distracted and we say, oh, actually, we can't vote for this because in the end, we'll end up with people losing their civil liberties. I do not believe that people lose their civil liberties or whatever it was, their personal liberties, because they have to have a licence of £30 a year, a form to fill in, to say they are going to rent a home to another human being. Landlords have a responsibility. Tenants have a responsibility to pay their rent. If they don't stay in the place. It's just, I mean, these are the things that happen. I would also say, sir, if we're going to talk about, it's very interesting because what sprung to mind when Deputy Balash was speaking earlier, and I can't remember the actual phrase about personal liberties, I think it was personal liberties, sir. There was a real irony there. When we have a system, for example, if you sign up for Social Security, you have to sign to give permission to get access to all of your bank accounts. And actually, the Social Security law allows the department to ask you about your sexual activity in order to determine whether you are in a meaningful relationship. That is an infringement of individual liberties. That is a direct infringement of individual rights. Now that is nowhere near asking somebody, now let's think about this, seriously think about this. Are you genuinely, sir, I ask members, conflating that with, you have to fill in a form to get a licence and pay £30 a year to show that you're a landlord? They are in different worlds, and the response to one should be very different from the response to another. So this is an opportunity today that we have to take in this assembly. We were here before. We need to be here again. And I would make the plea to not call this in for scrutiny again, because we have been through the scrutiny process with this. We know the way this is going to work. And I think that what was mentioned in terms of scrutinising is conflating some of these ideas. And I really hope we can just get on with the regulations this time. Because regulations can be changed later if they're not working. And I'm pretty sure, actually, the Minister is very pragmatic. And the Minister, actually, sir, gets criticism from me for being too pragmatic at times. And I accept that. But for today, it's very nice to be able to stand up and say, you're doing the right thing. And it's nice for me to be able to say that we are doing the right thing in this assembly, and that agreement across the assembly is vital for us to show to both tenants and to landlords. If you are providing a home for somebody of a good standard, that is at least at or often above minimum standards, and you are serious about doing that, we just want to know who you, that you are doing that, so that those who are not doing that, we have a standard that we can make them reach as well. You will not be undercut, you will not be undermined, and you will not be associated with those. That's where demonisation comes from, when you're associated with things that are not you. As a member of Reform, sir, I know how that works, because we're often associated with things that are nothing to do with us. And it doesn't work then, and it won't work now. So I urge members to think very, very carefully about the little pieces of straw that are being thrown at you and how they are sticking together in your mind. Please isolate them and look at what the reality is behind what we're trying to do here today in terms of a simple licensing system with a very low cost, so that we can move forward and raise the standards of our homes for everybody on this island. I urge members to support this in principle, sir. Thank you.
Thank you, Deputy. Deputy Wilson, your light came on briefly. Do you want to speak? Yes.
Thank you, sir. Pleased to follow Deputy Ward on that very powerful expression. But I'd like to start by saying that I personally enjoy the benefit of renting from a landlord who concerns himself with the fact that I and my partner, as his tenants, are comfortable and safe in the property that we rent with them, and proud to call it our home. But for those who cannot be assured in the same way, I concur with Deputy Tadia Ward and the Environment Minister, and also Deputy Luce, that I cannot stand by as Health Minister, knowing that poor housing conditions are actually leading to poor health outcomes. Some may say this is a preserve of those who are on low incomes or who experience vulnerability due to their age or ability, but it's not always. Finding one's voice even for the most articulate of individuals, can be off-putting, even daunting sometimes, especially if the threat of eviction is a real one. In this situation, it wouldn't be unusual to assume that a tenant could develop a high level of tolerance with their substandard accommodation, which ultimately leads to risks and hazards to their own health and safety. As the Environment Minister has already said, there is data, and there have already been over 100 complaints this year about housing. The figure is considerably higher when you consider that many tenants will not go to government in the first instance, or at all present, for such is their fear of reprisal. The Chief Executive of Caritas recently wrote saying that affected islanders do go to Caritas and many other charities, despite encouragement to report to government, but many feel frightened to do so. On average, they see about 200 reports from tenants a year, split quite evenly between worries about unhealthy conditions, mould, poor plumbing, and dangerous conditions, unfixed, damaged windows, unfixed wiring. And this is a similar story that is shared by a number of agencies and charities alike, particularly the Salvation Army, food banks, and the Citizens Advice Bureau. And I'm advised that they also see similar numbers. I think the key message here is that social determinants do actually have an important influences on the differences in our health, and so approach to licensing underpins public health intervention. Public health interventions being organised measures to prevent disease, promote health and prolong life amongst the population. So it will come as no surprise that my reasons for supporting the proposition are grounded in the ministerial responsibility for promoting good public health. Housing has got a long association with efforts to improve health, such as seeking to improve sanitation and reduce overcrowding to prevent the spread of infectious disease. And over time, there's a robust evidence base that causally links poor housing conditions with poor health outcomes. History tells us that health officials over time have targeted poor sanitation, crowding, and inadequate ventilation to reduce infectious disease, as well as fire hazards to decrease injuries. It is astonishing that at this time we face the same need to target these particular issues. It's now widely understood in public health and biomedical literature that a poor health environment with persistent exposure of children to parasites and infections can actually retard their nutritional absorption due to an environmental entropathy, which is disease of the small intestine. Children's health is particularly compromised in dwellings where there is a lack of access to bathroom facilities, clean water, heating in winter, and where there are damp conditions. And these conditions could have long-term consequences in physical growth outcomes also. Black mould was cited as a particular issue in the Jersey Children and Young People Survey in 2021. And was linked to low self-esteem and deprivation. And most of us read about the little boy in England, I think the minister referred to that earlier, who died as a result of mould in their dwelling. So a good standard of housing significantly improves the health of young children, and it's measured by decreases in the incidence of parasitic infection and the prevalence of anemia, and an improvement in cognitive development. And for adults, welfare is measured by increased satisfaction with their housing and quality of life where they enjoy better accommodation standards. So licensing can help to safeguard vulnerable groups, including children and young people. Substandard housing has also been associated with respiratory illness and diseases such as allergies, asthma, bronchitis, and lung cancer. And the evidence suggests that structurally deficient housing stock cultivates home environments that are rife with indoor asthma triggers. There's also evidence that overcrowding can affect health and respiratory conditions. Noise pollution, lack of privacy, and unsafe living conditions can contribute to stress, anxiety, and other mental health issues. There is evidence that overcrowded housing can lead to sleep problems and strained relationships. Research undertaken by the UK charity Shelter found that sleep is regularly disturbed because of living conditions, cramped living conditions, which which affect family relationships and negatively affect children's education. So licensing can create the conditions for safer and more supportive environments that lead to better mental health outcomes of tenants. Poor housing also disproportionately marginalises communities. It perpetuates health inequalities. A recent study by the British Medical Journal identified that people's health was adversely affected by old, damp and cold homes. The head of science and ethics at the BMA suggests the best way to reduce health inequalities is to improve living standards. And a systematic review by Thompson et al. Revealed that the best evidence indicates that housing, which is an appropriate size for the householder and is affordable to heat, is linked to improved health and may promote improved social relationships. There is a risk of accidents in the home where housing standards are not maintained. Housing hazards associated with poor health outcomes include air quality, warmth and humidity, radon, slips, trips and falls, noise, inadequate light and space, smoke and fires. These can lead, if they happen, to a loss of autonomy, greater isolation and depression, reduced mobility. So there is a wider concern to be had when we're considering the importance of actually increasing the standard associated with substandard housing. Although cases of falls are considered multifactorial, it's well established that environmental hazards in the home are implicated in as many as 1/3 of all falls, many of whom end up in hospital. So the values that we hold as citizens, as a society, in this regard are important. And I would ask members to ask themselves that we have an important choice to make in terms of the value that we hold around these particular issues. Are we really saying that we cannot support a basic initiative to improve the health and safety of tenants that basically enables all of our community to thrive and flourish? Landlords can support the prevention of hazards such as these through the basic provision of environmental safety features in bathrooms, toilets, halls and stairs. Licensing will help to enforce compliance with safety standards, reducing the risk of accidents, injuries and illness from occurring. Living in cold housing has been associated with lower general health status and increased use of health services. These health concerns have contributed to the development of standards for thermal comfort. So we can actually learn how to improve things by understanding the conditions and the experience people have in some standard accommodation with a view to improving things. And I see that as a relationship between the tenant and the landlord. And licensing is a means by which we can enforce some of those standards. Studies show that people's experience of housing instability may negatively affect people and their mental health. Licensing and the regulation of rental dwellings should empower tenants by ensuring their rights to safe and healthy living environments, to improving the safeguards and improving greater access to landlord information. These should also reduce the risk of revenge evictions, giving tenants greater stability and feeling safe to report concerns, both to and about landlords who are failing to meet their minimum standards. There are economic benefits to improving conditions. Investing in healthier rental dwellings does lead to reduced healthcare costs, absenteeism in the workplace, and improved productivity over time. And as I said earlier, sir, there is a plethora of evidence supporting these assertions. So based on the findings in the review of the evidence, I support the proposition and commend the Environment Minister for his personal commitment through these measures to improve public health for islanders. But I would also agree with Deputy Ward's view that please ask members to think more broadly about the impact that the licensing conditions have for the better health of islanders.
Deputy. Deputy Catherine Curtis.
Thank you, sir. It's good to follow the Health Minister with the interesting information about the health risks. My speech is a short one to focus on the core points, which I think is very useful when there are different interests and priorities involved. In the most recent census, 1/3 of households were private rentals. For those voting against this proposition, you will be leaving many thousands of families without the right, in real terms, to a safe home. When I was younger, many private renters did so temporarily. They might be here for a short time, they might have sold a house and be taking time before looking for another, but that is not the case anymore. We know that a person on an average salary can no longer buy a house unless they have substantial other funds. Many private renters nowadays are private renters for life. So we have to ensure that these many thousands of families, including many children, have the right to a safe home. And I will be supporting this very effective and proportionate proposition. Thank you.
Thank you, Deputy. Does any other member to speak on the principles? Deputy Andrews, then O'Connor, Hobson, Bland, then Deputy Howe. Deputy Andrews.
Thank you, sir. I have before me the Register of Names and Addresses, Jersey Law 2012. And the reason why I have this law on my laptop is because I think it's a fundamental piece of legislation. The Chief Minister under the law is responsible for holding information in regards to names and addresses. And I think this is probably a broader piece of work that could have been conducted. Now, in relation to this proposition today, what we do see is licensing for rental dwellings. And I do support the need for enforcement potentially where there are substandard accommodation in Jersey. But I do feel there is probably more work and more remit to ensure that we are providing coverage for ownership of property as well. And this is something that Deputy Higgins brought before the Assembly, and I think there was an overwhelming majority to support him in respect of finding out the number of monopolies that were in the housing market. And I think that provides a crucial piece of work because we could understand the reasons behind Jersey's partial market failure in housing, and it could provide us with the evidence we need to understand why things are so distorted. But looking at the proposition, we don't see any coverage in relation to ownership. It's just about the licensing of rental dwellings. And I think looking at Deputy Reniff in terms of what he has outlined, both in private briefings and also here today, it's fundamental that we see there is a proven need, absolutely, and that's something that he mentioned for a level of enforcement to be in place. But also he mentioned about there being a proven method. Now, I think there have been some reservations among some of the landlords who have obviously been contacting members, and I think they have, also mentioned some poignant issues that we as members have to be attentive to. I think when we're looking, for instance, where there could be a possibility where both the landlord and tenant are out the island for over a month, what happens then if, there is a due date where there is an inspection that's supposed to take place, and then, officers don't have entrance into the property? What is the process? So I think we need to kind of see more specific reasoning behind certain situations that the Minister and his officers could be encountering in that respect. But nevertheless, I think it's important that we do see something in place, because this is going to cover both social housing and the private sector as well. And I don't think that's been mentioned yet in the debate. So Andium Homes, for instance, will be responsible for paying £30 for each residential unit. Now, this is not just going to be the case where we could see an apartment block where there are 20 units and the person who is responsible, or the provider who is responsible for maintaining those units, being enforced for all 20 of those units. Each unit will be inspected individually, and I think that is really important that I do mention that, because it's been mentioned to us as States members during private briefings, but it's not been mentioned today here in the Assembly. Now, the other thing that needs to be mentioned, what happens if there is a property where a landlord needs to be enforced? So what I am saying here is the unit is not habitable. What happens to the household? Are they removed from a dwelling? Who is responsible for that process? Because again, I've not heard any such mention about this. And I would just like the Environment Minister just to provide some clarity, not just for States members, but also for landlords who are here today in the balcony, and also who may be listening online or perhaps on the radio as well. Because is it the landlord who is responsible for providing accommodation for their tenants whilst they are then having to renovate their property? Or is it the government, and is it the government's responsibility? Because I think we're coming into this debate with plenty of questions, and to some extent there haven't been the answers provided. And I think the Minister has done all he can, but there is further work that needs to be explained so people are comfortable with the process, both being a landlord and also being a tenant. Now, I am a tenant myself, and it has to be said, you know, I'm fortunately somebody who lives in social housing, but for those who live in the private rental sector, I think it's intimidating potentially having to report your circumstance to the department, and of course there is the insecurity of what happens to you, what happens to your family, because the landlord potentially could be seeking revenge if they have been reported, if they have been enforced, if they have been found to be culpable of neglecting their tenants and neglecting their property. So I think this level of inspection that we see, it will be better, but I can also understand as a landlord having your property inspected and not being given notice why some people potentially could be antithetical toward that as well, because we have to understand here there are some very good landlords. I've had a couple of discussions with landlords, and I think they understand as a government something needs to be in place, because there are circumstances where some landlords give everybody else a bad name. And it is those landlords, as a government, as a legislature, we need to be targeting, we need to be addressing them. They should not have property. If they cannot maintain their portfolio, they have to be enforced. And I think this today, where we see that the licensing, that will allow us to provide that enforcement. But what are the conditions for enforcement? And I think that's also another question where some landlords have been saying, so how will I be judged? What is the specific criteria? Is it already prescribed in our legislation or not? And I think there is a level of ambiguity, because I've had some people saying they believe there is a good foundation already in place, but then I speak to other people who've informed me they feel there is a huge level of ambiguity and they are very nervous about this implementation happening. And that has to be understood. We have to listen to people. You know, we were elected by our constituents, and our constituents are comprised of who? Both landlords and tenants. We've got to try and find that balance. But I think it's just important that the Environment Minister provides some clarity with some of the questions I have raised, but also, as I mentioned earlier on in my speech, about the register of names and addresses, because it could make things so much easier instead of coming back to the Assembly in the future and saying, well, you know what, we need to be addressing, you know, beneficial ownership of property, and also we could have the information in terms of how many private rental dwellings there are. instead of having this convoluted process where we've got all these government departments holding different information about where people are based and their residency. Because I think we do have incorrect information across government departments because it's not updated enough. And if we just have one central mechanism in place, I think it would make it a lot easier. So thank you, sir.
Deputy. Conrad Harbison-Brillard.
Thank you, sir. And whilst I wouldn't wish to repeat what others have already eloquently said in this debate, I would like to emphasise the point made by Deputy Andrews just now that the providers of social rented accommodation, and in particular our own arm's length organisation, Andium Homes, are included in the Minister's proposed scheme. I do question what the benefit will be to tenants apart from a disbenefit of a £30 cost per annum. Surely, sir, these providers will already have their own inspection regimes, so are we just not duplicating their efforts? The Minister, sir, will argue, I'm sure, that we should be fair across the field, but I take the view that it seems rather circumlocutory and achieves very little. I'm sure the scrutiny panel, sir, on which I sit, will consult those social housing providers to understand better what inspections they presently carry out and benefits, if any, which may accrue as a result of the passing of these proposals. Another consequence, sir, of these proposals will be the removing of properties from the market. In the instance that older properties are suddenly required to upgrade to standards insisted upon by the Minister's officers, there is a risk, sir, that a decision will be made not to proceed based on cost and to dispose of the property. Tenants will have no choice but to leave. We do so need to quantify the numbers of those who may be affected in this way. We've heard so much of mould, damp and windows. I'm not a landlord, sir, but experience does tell me that these issues are often, but not always, driven by the lifestyle of the occupant, in particular in connection with the lack of ventilation. These matters, sir, are often outside the ability of a landlord to control. I do believe, of course, sir, there is already an obligation in place for electrical checks. So in conclusion, there is more work to be done to avoid us introducing this divisive legislation, and it's something at present I cannot support. Thank you, sir.
Thank you, Conrad. Deputy Howell.
Thank you, sir. We can all agree that no islander should be forced to live in substandard accommodation. There is no excuse for dangerous electrics, and neither would anyone wish for a child to be subject to damp or mouldy living conditions. We all want decent homes for everyone. Squalor, though, a term that I might take the Minister to task on, because it is often not the landlord, but it is the tenant who's responsible. And I'm also aware that most landlords are good landlords and most tenants are good tenants. But landlords and tenants equally need to have protection from one another if they aren't coming up with the goods. My inbox has been full with messages from landlords and not just copy and paste emails in opposition to these proposals. My problem is with the unintended consequences, and I'm worried about bureaucratic creep. The officers and the ministers will reign supreme. What happens if the officers attending a property are too officious? What will the actual standards be? I have the impression that what is being proposed gives private landlords too little cause for redress. The minister's view is final. If you don't like his or her decision, tough. You may be able to appeal for the rent tribunal, but we don't have a rent tribunal at the moment. Failing that, there is a possibility of a judicial review, but how much will that cost? We should not be bringing any law until it is clear. So my main concern is there's been no proper consultation with landlords. Will it only be possible to apply for a licence online? Some people don't landlords may not be able to do that, sir. My worry is that landlords will be driven out of the market or choose to leave, but we are reliant on them for a third of our rental property. If they decide not to leave their properties let their properties in future, then the island will be in a mess. Worse, without a licence, an individual or family will be homeless. So if they don't have a licence, who is responsible? Where will they go? I'm all for having good properties, but I think we must make sure, first of all, that Andium properties are up to scratch. And I would prefer to be encouraging landlords to sign up to the Rent Save scheme and encourage those with 1 or 2 stars to improve, but not to demonise all landlords, sir. We already have the 2018 law that tenants can use to ask environmental health to check properties. Sir, let us promote that and encourage any tenant to be able to apply for that and then get the officers who are employed. We've got 6 officers already employed to be doing this work. Let us let them do that. I stood for bureaucracy, for less bureaucracy and less red tape. Sir, if a section of our community are clearly making it known that they are unhappy and we are at risk of permanently alienating them, then we should be listening. How much better it would be if the Minister of Housing and the Minister of the Environment could work together. I know they do different things, and I know one's for regulation or one's for housing, but I think we should get them to be talking together. And I think at the moment these proposals leave too much it's not clear, and we shouldn't be passing it. But I am a real proponent of good, decent homes for people. Thank you, sir.
Thank you, Deputy. Deputy Sharon.
Thank you. Sir, I'm a landlord of a number of properties in Jersey, and I support this proposition, which I consider reasonable and proportionate. The Public Health and Safety Rented Dwellings Minimum Standards and Prescribed Hazards Order 2018 stipulates the minimum requirements which ensures rented properties do not pose a risk to the health and safety of its tenants. Landlords should have been complying with this legislation since 2018, but it's clear and unfortunate that there are some that do not comply, and enforcement has been difficult. Mould is often cited when discussing standards, and officers do take tenant behaviour into consideration, but they do see properties with cracks, broken gutters, no bathroom ventilation that also causes mould. But I wanted to remind members of some of the other minimum standards that should be met by landlords. Personally, as a responsible landlord, I feel these are the bare minimum to ensure the health and safety of my tenants, rather than excessive bureaucracy. Install and maintain a smoke alarm. Install and maintain a carbon monoxide alarm in any habitable room of a rented property with a gas, wood, oil, coal, or similar heater or burner. Sir, the threat is real. A friend many years ago died in his bath from carbon monoxide poisoning, leaving 4 young children, the youngest being 6 months old. The threat is real. Have an annual gas safety inspection. In the aftermath of the terrible tragedies that we witnessed in Jersey in December, this seems a reasonable request. Commission a professional electrical safety inspection to ensure electrical safety. And there's also a list of prescribed hazards beyond damp and mould growth, such as excessive cold, excessive heat, exposure to asbestos fibres, and something that we've all talked about, asbestos, earlier today already, and the dangers there. Inadequate personal hygiene, sanitation and drainage, lack of access to safe water supply, which can you imagine that is in a law today in Jersey, and avoidance of structural collapse, which could potentially harm tenants, their families. So it's interesting how we look at this question of too much bureaucracy or excessive regulation and put it into some context. When it comes to other sectors of the economy, we take a very different view. For example, when it comes to ensuring that our finance industry remains safe and trusted, we're very quick to regulate. Indeed, regulation is seen as a badge of honour, is it not? Jersey Finance says on its website that strong regulation and intellectual international compliance are critical to our competitive offering, a priority shared by government, industry and regulator, and a position consistently recognised by international evaluation bodies. In finance, we pride ourselves on being well regulated. Over the last few months, we've made several changes to our regulatory framework in this chamber in the lead up to Moneyval. Why? Because strong regulation reassures all players, clients, companies, international bodies, that we're playing by the rules. It guarantees high standards. Why should housing be any different? Should we not be proud of effective regulation in the market for rented housing? Should we not be wanting to offer tenants reassurance that they are entering a market that guarantees minimum standards are respected? Should we not be demonstrating to people who we invite to come and work here that they can be sure that they will be living in safe accommodation? So the licensing scheme being proposed is a light touch and proportionate response to a known problem. Just like with finance and other sectors of the economy, effective regulation is a key part of a functioning market, giving confidence to all sides that basic standards are being observed and that enforcement is efficient. There's nothing for good landlords to fear in these proposals. I found advice from Vibert that was published after the 2018 law was introduced, and it says, if you are a landlord and your rented property does not meet these minimum requirements, you could be liable to a hefty fine and investigation. An introduction of a licensing scheme, therefore, is, as I said already, a light touch compared to this, because it gives landlords time to fix any problems, supported by enforcement officers who will, and as we've heard, engage, explain, encourage, and enforce in that order, and not go straight into a hefty fine or a heavy investigation that could lead to criminal prosecution. Officers will work with the landlord to sort out any issues with the meeting minimum standards. To address Deputy Scott's point on random inspection, they are theoretically allowed, as the AG confirmed, but in practice it's not possible because we don't know where the rented dwellings are. Otherwise, we only know the ones that have had complaints against them, and therefore the landlords themselves will know it's the tenant that has complained. Officers will support the landlord or agent to identify hazards, suggest remedial work needed to bring the place up to minimum standards, and to remove prescribed hazards in making changes, giving time to do these upgrades, especially in an island where contractors are busy and it's difficult to pin down. I have experience with that myself. All seasonal factors affect repairs. The decision to withdraw or refuse a licence will then only be based on the lack of action taken by the landlord to bring about the necessary improvements to meet minimum standards. The lack of action. Landlords are obliged to annually register and pay a minimum of £50 to the Office of the Information Commissioner. This has been confirmed by the Office of the Information Commissioner to me today. This is done under the Data Protection Law of 2018, and as landlords hold sensitive information about tenants. The JOIC works with the JLA to support landlords meeting their obligations to adhere to this law. Have you heard that this has been too bureaucratic for landlords? A drag on productivity? Have landlords left the market because of this requirement? I would hazard or risk a guess it has not, as we haven't heard from landlords that this has been the case. So the Minister has spoken about the numbers of people who contact housing and nuisance officers every year and why it's difficult to pursue these cases. But what about putting some flesh on the bones of statistics? Here are some case studies that were investigated by officers. The words are directly taken from reports. Case 1. The bathroom sink is cracked and the tenant has concerns that the sink will fall to pieces. The shower door is defective and water leaks onto the floor. The fire alarm in the hallway is out of date and requires replacement. There are several areas of disrepair in the roof, guttering and soffit has rotted. There are several cracks to the exterior and interior of the property. The tenant advised the landlord is aware of the issues and they have refused to carry out any remedial works within the property. The tenant has been provided with a report but does not wish us to contact the landlord at this time as they are concerned they will be evicted by the landlord. Case 2. There is a significant amount of damp and mould throughout the dwelling. A moisture meter was used to measure levels in both bedrooms, living room and utility room. The meter indicated high levels of moisture present. There are signs of water ingress on the ceiling in the main bedroom. The windows throughout the dwelling require servicing to ensure they are made wind and watertight. The rubber seals and handles are defective in both bedrooms. There are gaps around the windows in both bedrooms and kitchen where tape have been placed to stop the draft coming in. Heating in the living room is not working. The tenant did not wish us to make contact with the landlord. The tenant advised these issues have been brought to the landlord's attention on numerous occasions, and the justification for no remedial works to be carried out was that the tenant is paying cheap rent. Case 3. The heating in the bedroom was defective and there was no heating in the second bedroom. The sash cord on the window in the bedroom to the front of the property was defective and the timber frame was not secure and a draft was coming through. The floor is lifting and uneven. The drainage system is blocked and a foul smell was coming from the kitchen sink. The tenant wanted advice and did not wish us to make contact with the managing agent landlord as they were concerned they would be evicted from the property. Sir, I urge States members to support the Minister's reasonable and proportionate proposition. Thank you.
Thank you, Deputy. Deputy Ayer.
Thank you, sir. This proposal is almost identical to the one brought to this Assembly by the previous Minister for the Environment, P33 2021, which was defeated by a slender margin. The major difference between the two is that the current amendment is asking for a licence to be permitted for a period of 2 years, whereas the previous Minister had lodged an amendment to the articles that would have allowed for a licence period of 5 years. One must ask why the length of the licences has been so dramatically reduced. This will be extremely relevant to certain sections of the rental sector. What are the cost implications to landlords? It has been said that the licence fee is so small that it would have no tangible impact on the rental market. But what of the large social housing providers, who will also be required to have licences for each individual unit which they rent out? It has been estimated that Andium will have to pay in the region of £150,000 every 2 years for these licences under the proposed scheme. This will be considerably more than was suggested in P33. Indeed, within a 5-year period, they would have had to have contributed nearly £500,000 to the total cost of the scheme, which under the previous scheme would have been free for the initial 5 years. It seems to me that Andium are being asked to fund most of the revenue raising themselves, and yet they are, I am sure all members will agree, a truly wonderful contributor to the rental market with many years of experience and provide a thoroughly good service to a large number of islanders. They should be congratulated for all the hard work which they do and will continue to do in the future. This proposal places the greatest financial burden, and it is a punitive one, on the one sector which is unlikely to ever fail an inspection. I believe that this is unreasonable. It is implied within the report that only 6 employees will be required to carry out the task of inspection and compliance. That seems to me to be a very onerous task, and I believe that I can safely predict that this number will increase dramatically in the years to come. How can so few people inspect thousands of properties? To me, the figures do not add up, and with any increase in FTEs, the overall cost will rise exponentially. The Minister will have the ability to raise fees by ministerial order, and on my own assumptions, this will be sooner rather than later. What effect will that have on the rental markets? Well, it will certainly be inflationary. Is this necessary when there are already mechanisms in place to deal with the few errant landlords? It must be noted that since the introduction of the extra 3% stamp duty on the purchase of properties to rent, the number of such properties sold has decreased dramatically. We must be cautious when bringing forward proposals that may adversely affect an already stagnant housing market. We must recognise the important contribution that landlords make to the rental market, and we understand their concerns about the many changes that are being brought forward to the sector. Once again, we are overseeing the introduction of more bureaucracy, more red tape, more regulation, leading to excessive administrative burdens. Is this necessary? In 2021, I voted against P33, along with a number of current ministers, and I will find it very difficult not to do so again today. Thank you, sir.
Deputy. Does any other member wish to speak on the principles? Deputy Mayor Zach.
Thank you, sir. I have lost count of how many iterations of a licensing scheme we've either debated in this Assembly or at least explored outside of the Assembly before deciding whether to bring to it or not. We've looked at iterations involving an annual licence, a 2-year licence, 5-year licence. We've looked at versions with no fees whatsoever, fees that are flat across the board, and even a graded structure of fees. But what is in this proposition today is essentially the same in its structure as to every iteration that has come forward before. It is about changing the rules for renting out property now, so that in order to rent out a property, a landlord must have a licence for that property that confirms that it meets all of the minimum health and safety standards which are already in law, and that is it. Nothing has substantially changed in that time. The structure of what's proposed today is the same. The evidence in its support is the same, and the arguments on both sides are the same. Nothing whatsoever materially has changed in those 4 years. The only change that has occurred in that time is a change to the political makeup of this chamber, and speaking frankly, that is the only thing upon which I pin my hopes on today for this proposition. Whether you're in favour of this or not is ultimately a political call for each member to make, and we can argue over it as much as we like, but we're simply repeating exercises that have happened before. It's a political call between whether you accept the political position espoused by Deputy Balash in support of personal liberty, that is the personal liberty to be able to rent out unsafe homes to people who themselves don't have much personal liberty because they don't have the same agency as those with more money than them, or whether you hold the political position that it is right that government steps in from time to time to mitigate the worst excesses that can sometimes proliferate in a totally unregulated free market. And the case for this is so well made on so many other levels. We've heard the examples before from...
So may I interrupt the...
Well, only if you propose will give way.
Yes, of course.
Well, I'm grateful to the Deputy for giving way because he, I'm sure, inadvertently misled the Assembly just now in suggesting that my position was that it was a liberty for landlords to rent out unsafe accommodation. That was my position. I made it absolutely clear that that was not my position and that all members of the Assembly, I'm quite sure, wish to see safe accommodation occupied by tenants.
So it's lovely that some may use those words, but I believe actions count louder than words. And if he's not prepared to vote for an enforcement regime that puts those words into reality, then I'm afraid I can't take them that seriously. And that is why I make the point. He had a philosophical position against what he might term as government overreach because of his political persuasion. It's a persuasion he's entitled to have, but it's not one that I have or will ever defend. And so that approach of a licensing regime is one that exists in all sorts of other ventures and considered completely uncontroversial. We've heard the examples of dog licensing, gun licensing, licensing for restaurants. We never hear the argument that we don't need to have licensing to confirm the hygienic conditions in restaurants. We don't need that regime, we just need more restaurants. We never hear that argument because, of course, it's so absurd. And so the other licensing regime that exists that I'm surprised hasn't been mentioned, sir, you are not allowed to turn on your television without a license for it. And that license costs you £159 a year. And if you get anything wrong in that process, it doesn't affect anyone's health. So any argument that what's proposed in this proposition is somehow too cumbersome, too burdensome, too bureaucratic, I simply can't accept when in our society we have a regime that stops you from even watching your television without a license for it. If you're in the business of renting out properties in a market, providing a service upon which so many people depend on for their livelihood and for their health and safety, to ask them to pay a fee which will in actual fact amount to less than £30 a year, because it will be a tax-deductible business expense, so the real cost will be less than £30 a year, can surely not be too much to ask. The evidence of the problem most certainly does exist. I know from my time as Housing Minister and working with the brilliant team in the Environmental Health Department of all of the cases that they have dealt with. I've known that as a constituency representative more widely as well. Citizens Advice Bureau know all about it. Caritas know all about it. The Salvation Army know all about the problem. And what is proposed here to address that, compared to what we impose on other sectors, is absolutely nothing extraordinary. It's to ask for a form to be filled in once every 2 years, an extremely modest licensing fee paid for that, and if you are already compliant with all of the laws that you should be, that is the extent of the burden upon which will be placed on you. The only cases that have anything to be concerned about by this are those who may be caught out by a licensing scheme and be discovered to not be in compliance with those other laws. And in fact, for many of those people, that actually won't be a bad thing. It will be a good thing, because in my experience, the vast majority of landlords are decent and responsible and want to comply with the law. And some of them, despite all the best will in the world, may occasionally just miss something or make a mistake. And what will this licensing regime do? It will help them identify where there are problems, and they'll get free advice from the Environmental Health Department about how to fix it. That's the sort of thing that in the long run could save them a lot of money if something went wrong and somebody ended up being hurt by it. They'll get free advice and support and help through a very tolerant approach that will be adopted by the Environmental Health, something to surely welcome. The only people who would have anything to fear from it are those who, for reasons I simply can't fathom, would object to complying with anything whatsoever. And those are people who I would guess are in an extremely small minority, but whose views I don't think we should be pandering to in any instance here. So we have, of course, been lobbied very heavily on this, and arguments have been made against the proposition, which are identical to arguments which came up in previous times. But there was one that Deputy Howell mentioned in her speech that I cannot leave unanswered, and it is the argument that there's been no proper consultation on this. This has been consulted to death, quite frankly. There have been scrutiny reviews on it. The previous Environment Minister held a wide-ranging consultation on it. I know because I was in the room for much of it. I saw those events at the Town Hall where the proposals were presented, and those proposals were then changed when they came to the Assembly because that consultation had an impact. And I know that the current Environment Minister has himself made efforts to speak to those with an interest in these regulations to hear their views. The point, sir, is that some people just disagree. They don't like the scheme and they don't want it, but they should not be saying that there's been no proper consultation, because there's been far more consultation on this than we engage with on, frankly, other matters that create greater burdens on others. And she also made a comment, sir, about us being at risk of alienating people upon whom we rely to provide that housing. So in my personal experience, and I'll freely admit that this is simply anecdote, but most of the landlords who I speak to, I have friends, I have family members, I have party members who are landlords who I speak to frequently. vast majority of those who I find are actually perfectly in favour of this. They don't think it's overly bureaucratic. They don't think it's unreasonable, especially considering the requirements that every other business venture would have to abide by. But I tell you who is feeling alienated. It's the tenants. It's the people who don't feel that their voice is heard and who are often too scared to speak out because of the consequences they're worried they will face. Why are we not concerned about those people being alienated? So I listened and I was so amused when Deputy Balash spoke about his investigations into finding out the extent of revenge evictions in Jersey, and he mentioned how he had spoken to somebody in the courts to find out what records they had on this, and he was surprised to find that there were no records in the Petty Debts Court of revenge evictions. It's interesting that he went to the court, solely to the court, to ask that. He didn't go to Citizens Advice, he didn't go to Caritas, he didn't go to Salvation Army, who themselves could have given him plenty of evidence. But the reason why the Petty Debts Court would not have any cases of revenge evictions there is because revenge evictions are perfectly legal in Jersey. They are allowed under the residential tenancy law, where a periodic tenancy can be ended with 3 months' notice at any time for any reason, and there are no grounds of appeal for it. It can simply be done on the whim of the landlord with no reason provided. And many of the times they may do that may well be perfectly reasonable and justified, but if they're not reasonable or justified, that makes no difference whatsoever in the application of that clause in the residential tenancy law. That's why they don't end up in court, because there's no case to be made in court. There's nothing the court can do to protect them. And that is why some people will ask environmental health officers, and I've had this myself as a constituency representative when I've liaised with environmental health about cases where they are very worried about complaints being formally made in case they get that 3 months notice issued because they've just stood up for themselves a little bit too much. So they're perfectly allowable under the current system. So the Constable of St Brelard referred to these regulations as being divisive. I would wager that out there in the real world, they're probably not. And again, this is purely guesswork, but this is the kind of thing that, if I weren't so busy with every other element of my job, I'd quite like to have a referendum on, because I think the result would be so conclusive in favour of these from a wide cross-section of society, including those good landlords who don't want themselves to receive a bad name by the minority who don't comply, and wider society and tenants in particular who'd want to see this through. It is only divisive for a relatively small part of our population, most of whom, when you read the arguments that are put to us, are littered with misunderstandings about what is actually being proposed and what powers the government already has on this. And when they have attempted to propose the alternative of a register, have continued to make that proposition despite a definitive and, in my view, unbeatable case against it being made, in that a register provides all of the bureaucracy with none of the benefits. Doing nothing is a cheaper option of getting the same result than a registration scheme, because it doesn't stop a single unsafe property from being let out. So as I said earlier in my remarks, I think this is an exercise of repeating ourselves and doing what the previous Assembly did on multiple occasions. The only thing I pin my hopes on now is that the political makeup of this chamber is different to the last time this was debated, and I hope that members will see, given the result in that election for the Alliance Party, which had most closely been associated to the opposition to this scheme, and the gutting that they got in that election, this, I think, is a proposal that has a perfectly decent mandate from the public, and I hope those members who replaced those previous out-of-touch members will vote in support of it this time, including those who may not have done so last time. Thank you, sir.
Thank you, Deputy. Does any other member speak on the principles? Yes, Clotard of...
Thank you, sir. I'm the first to rail against bad bureaucracy. I'll tell you what bad bureaucracy is to me. I got bitten by a dog, not in a Swiss hotel lobby, but out on delivery in Grouville. I spent 7.5 hours in A&E, and I spent precisely 1 minute with a medical professional who gave me a tetanus injection. That poor individual then spent the next 17 minutes filling in forms to say that they had given me a tetanus injection. That is bad bureaucracy. I know teachers every day that have to go home and fill in endless forms about the day they've just spent and the day they're about to work. That's bad bureaucracy. I know of childminders, probably 10 or so a year, that have been leaving their industry, very dedicated industry, sir, because of bureaucracy. And other bad systems like the JFSC's annual company confirmation form, which not even they can fill in. That is bad systems, that's bad bureaucracy. This at least, sir, and I commend the Minister for bringing this forward, this at least is going to pay for itself. I beg to ask his forgiveness for that. Sir, I don't think any good landlord, and the majority should have any fears about this new scheme, because they are already complying with it, and they should have no doubts about that at all. But I would say that I'll be looking in the future to any more bureaucracy coming forward, as I've mentioned to the Minister before, to make sure that this industry is not overladen with said. Thank you.
Thank you, Colin Clark. Does any other member wish to speak on the principles? Deputy Gorst.
Thank you, sir. Well, it's certainly been an interesting debate so far today. But I want to return to the chair of the scrutiny panel's early intervention. He didn't use his full allotted time, which is unlimited, as the main respondent to the Minister's proposal. And the reason I want to return to that is because he spoke a little of the need, firstly, for the existing regulation, which sets out quite clearly the obligations of landlords. And again, Deputy Scott picked up on some of this, the existing obligations of landlords. And he reminded the Assembly of the then Housing Minister, I think it was, that brought that forward. And it was, two things were held in tension at that point. One was that it would, on its own, improve standards across the board. And the other was that there may need to be a further system introduced to ensure that there was compliance. And the reality is, I think, that previous governments and previous assemblies have struggled with that further system which would ensure compliance. And so for me, this has been really quite a difficult debate, because I'm moving towards voting with some colleagues who've said things for whom I disagree so intently. And that is that we should not find ourselves divided, because I do not associate myself with comments which largely are taking on in the public domain. And I think one of the reasons why we've seen so much contact from members of the public is this idea that landlords are somehow monsters and they are the bad in society. I'm not saying anyone said it today, but I'm saying that this is a divisory narrative which has been maybe not spoken quite in those terms, but certainly there's been this intimation. And I know that there are landlords who have approached me who certainly feel that. And that for me is strange, because and the reason I say that is because our housing market in Jersey has always relied on a healthy private rental sector. And government policy has acknowledged that, yes, there would be the social rented sector, and government would do that, but there would always be a healthy and important private rental sector. And yet we've seen a narrative of division over the last number of years. And I do not accept that narrative. I accept, for my part, and perhaps I have to be careful because I am one, that our housing market, our housing economy requires a strong supply of private rental accommodation, but it is important that that private rented accommodation is of a high standard. And again, for my part, landlords that I speak to and those that I have been lobbied by, I believe do meet that high standard. They know what the regulatory requirement is, and they meet that high standard. But there are inevitably, unfortunately, those that do not. And therefore the ministers, in bringing forward this proposal, is seeking to ensure that there are appropriate mechanisms in place to ensure that those that don't meet those regulatory standards, there is a mechanism to, I might use the word, encourage them to make those improvements and those changes. And I use the word encouragement because I do recognise that sometimes across government, some of our colleagues can become at times overzealous and at times officious. I don't for a minute believe that they will with the current minister in post. That is certainly not how I have seen him operate and fulfil his functions, rather the reverse. Now, when these proposals were first proposed, one of the objections I very much had was that there was going to be a requirement to employ at least 5 or 6 more individuals in the department, and some members have mentioned that in their comments today. That, of course, is not the case, because those officials are, for right or wrong, already employed in the department and already doing other important compliance work, and therefore they can simply broaden out and do this licensing compliance work as well. But this Assembly and this Minister and future ministers will need to continually review and ensure that when they're delegating their functions under this law, those delegations are appropriate and that they are fully briefed and appraised of the state of play in the market with regards to licences and with regards to compliance of the regulations. And the reason that I go back to distancing myself from some of the comments that others have made is that I do not, from a political philosophy point of view, as others have said, believe that regulation and licensing is a general good, and that we can point to lots of other areas where government is involved and government bureaucracy is of a general good and has improved things. I'm sure there are areas where it has, but there are equally other areas where if we actually undertook a review of improvements in those areas that regulation, licensing and government bureaucracy has brought, I think we would find that there could be some lightening of that bureaucratic load, and I think we'd find that there could be some rolling back of that bureaucratic load as well. Government involvement is not a general good and a general cure for all of the difficulties which our community faces. But it does have a place, and I go back again to what the chair of the scrutiny panel said, and that is that we wish to ensure that all housing stock right across our economy is of an appropriate and high standard. I also come back to this general point about behaviour of landlords and tenants. And I know that some have made comments about mould, about damp, and we had that terrible situation in the UK where a young child lost their life. But anyone that knows anything about the housing market knows that there can be damp and mould of that sort of magnitude, which requires landlord's intervention. But we also heard, quite rightly, Deputy Howells spoke to us, that there can be internal general dampness, which can come from the way that some tenants live. And we've got to stop pretending that there is a great divide and that the answer to all of these situations is just action in one particular direction, because it is not. And so, for my part, the question I think is the right question to ask is, can this licensing scheme help to ensure compliance with the regulations which are currently in place, and can it carefully and proportionately work with landlords by issuing licenses straight away in the first instance with registering or completing the form, paying the fee, and then working through the system. And what we have before us today, I think, on balance, taking into account everything that members have said and the things that the Minister has said, I think that on balance it can. Now, I know that some members are thinking on balance they're not sure if it can. And at one point today, so I thought I was going to be signing up to become a Liberal Conservative. But I should, yes, I'm being told I should. Well, clear blue water at last, sir. But when I look at what is before us, I go down on the side that I think that there can be positives and there can be benefits in ensuring compliance through this licensing system. But what I would say to members who may be wobbling over to the other side is listen to and remind ourselves to what the chair of the scrutiny panel said. And he said that if the principles are accepted today, which is that we need a different and an enhanced mechanism to ensure compliance, if those principles are accepted, he and his panel will take it away and do a further piece of work, which I've got no doubt will, I'm hesitating to look at those frowning at me in the gallery, which I've got no doubt will re-engage with some of those concerns that landlords have, and some of the concerns that members of this assembly have, to ensure that the practical application of the articles can be administered in a proportionate way. And therefore I do think that members can, whichever side they're slightly wobbling on still, can support this and these principles and allow that additional piece of work to be done with the Minister, who I know wants a system which ultimately will work and will ultimately see standards where they are below standard. And that is not, it is, to my mind, in a minority of cases. Where it is below standard, he can ensure that they reach that standard. Thank you, sir.
Thank you, Deputy. Deputy Southern.
Thank you, sir. And what a joyful thing it is to have the support of Deputy Gorst in finally coming to some sort of slightly wobbly but fairly solid grounds for proceeding with these proposals. So my question briefly is, should we engage with a regulation and license system in order to regulate what is currently a free market in the private sector rental? And for me, the answer is obvious. The answer is yes, of course we should. And why? And I remind us that the contribution of the Health Minister was very significant in this. The reason why is I believe our duty of care actually extends beyond the third party. The Andium Homes belongs to the private market. And despite the temptation to talk about light regulation, these regulations must be light. One of the things that goes wrong with Jersey in terms of its politics is that it may set up principles and policies, but often ignores enforcement. And without some form of enforcement, and this is very light, we often end up going nowhere. I think members will sleep better in their beds tonight if they support this proposition.
Thank you, Deputy. If no other members to speak, yes, Deputy Coles.
Thank you, sir. Just a short one from me this afternoon. It just so happens that I was speaking to a property manager, not a landlord themselves, but actually someone who manages properties on behalf of landlords. And it was just in a casual conversation, as we all know, as local politicians, we don't really get time off from our jobs. If somebody sees you, recognises they want to talk to you. And they're talking to me about the this landlord licensing and how they actually thought it was a good thing, because sometimes they have pushback from the property owners of properties that they manage for works that need to be done so they can comply to regulation. So they were very positive in the fact that actually here was a mechanism that was going to be clearer, that they wouldn't necessarily be picked on by the owners of the properties that they manage on their behalf, because they can actually refer to the license to the environment without them being one of the people who may be persecuted as, oh, actually, my management agent grasped me up to the Environment Department, or my tenant grasped me up, when they know that they actually have to maintain properties to a decent standards. They were also very supportive of the work being carried out by the Minister for Housing on the White Paper, again, just for clarity, so they can actually do the jobs that they were employed for. I also, in hearing all the debate over this afternoon as well, the question over whether are we arguing over the name of what it is. Is it a licence? Is it registration? Is it the fee that there's a problem? Is a £30 fee too much because they're worried about having to pass that on when a one-bedroom flat is going to be charged £1,400 a month? I struggle, especially when I consider my wife has to register with Health to do the job that she does, but she's not regulated. Anybody can advertise themselves doing the jobs that she does because it's not protected titles, but there is requirements to people's health that she does it properly. And so when we talk about how people, as the Health Minister has brought forward, there is health implications that come from properties which aren't being well managed. And so these things need to be pointed out to people. And people, I don't believe anybody goes into becoming a landlord with ill intentions. Sometimes things happen, things slip by. Sometimes it's just a lack of knowledge. And actually this light touch that's being proposed by the Minister is actually very encouraging to hear, because sometimes people don't need to be hit in hard saying you have done this wrong, you're going to face the consequences. And actually it's a case of, sorry, you really need to improve this. I mean, this is why in health and safety you have the RAG rating, red, amber, green. Green is okay, amber needs work doing to it, red must be done straight away. And this principle is very good to actually, for the Environment Department to be administering to some of these people who might simply not know that there is an issue. And this also, don't get me wrong, this can also then involve the landlord referring themselves to the Environment Department. So if their tenant is not doing what they need to do, opening windows to vent things out, actually, they can ask the Environment Department to come along, tell them, look, this is a problem that we're having. Please, can you tell our tenant that we are not blaming them, but this is something that needs to be done within their property to make sure that it helps meet their standards as well. I actually see there's many, many bonuses to this, and if it only costs £30 a year, that is negligible. And like we say, it covers the staff's time. And we're always talking about cost-benefit realisation in our role as government. When we look at the data produced in the 2021 census about the number of potential rented dwellings out there between social, qualified and non-qualified accommodation, you're looking at about 18,000 properties. Now, if you have 6 members of staff that need to carry out certain checks or random checks and be able to utilise the regulation that already exists, it's like knocking on every other door asking, sorry, is this rented? Also, who is your landlord? But actually, by gathering this data, straight away they know. It's quicker, it's more efficient, and it's a better use of resources that we have. So, I'm sorry, I just don't see a downside for this. There's so many benefits that outweigh any negligible complaints that we have seen so far. So, I very much support this proposition.
Thank you, Deputy. Deputy Ward.
Thank you, sir. I just wanted to put a slightly sort of a moral tale into this discussion today. I want to talk about the commodification of housing and the impact of that way of thinking. My background is in coffee, the world's second most traded commodity after oil. Once upon a time, only those businesses that traded in coffee created the market. Post the financial crash of 2008, coffee and other commodities started to be traded like stocks and shares. Basic foodstuffs are now traded as investment opportunities, and we wonder why we have the infamous heating or eating issue. The provision of a home is always about the person. It cannot and should never be commodified. So how does this relate to our own housing issues and our attitude to investing in housing? There have always been investors in housing. I would suggest that the vast majority of landlords in today's Jersey market are long-term investors. They're in it for the long term. It's not in their interest to see tenants come and go. So as a result, they mostly look after those for whom they provide a home. Times have changed. Jersey's housing market, up until 2023, has been a very lucrative one for some. Between 2011 and 2021, there was a 38% increase in the number of qualified rented properties. That was just under 3 times greater than the increase in home ownership. I don't have an issue with individuals wanting to invest in something they see a good return on, which they see as a good return on capital. I do, however, have an issue with investors who look to sweat their asset to the detriment for whom this asset is their home. Citizens Advice had 2,079 housing-related queries. That's 23% of all the inquiries they received in the last 12 months. We've all had an email from Caritas overnight. These are organisations who deal with people with few choices when it comes to a place to live. They're the least likely to complain. As has already been mentioned, I'm looking to update the residential tenancy law. In that law, I hope to bring in a housing tribunal. That will work alongside the rental dwellings licensing law. This will effectively join up the dots. Both tenants and landlords will at last have a safe space. Security of tenure is a human right. Having a decent place to live is a human right. I will support my fellow minister and urge other members to do so. Thank you.
Thank you, Deputy. I call upon the Minister to reply. Minister.
Thank you, sir. I'm going to go through some of the points that were raised by people to try and provide a sort of a fairly complete response to the questions that have been raised, and then make some very short concluding remarks. Deputy Balash started and made a number of points which I wanted to tackle. He says that most landlords are decent and honourable, and he indeed, as many other members have said, want the bad eggs, if you like, relentlessly pursued. And I think that is a universally shared view. This is all about how we do it. And the licensing scheme that I have brought forward is intended to make that an efficient and effective process. I think there's been a certain amount of misinformation put out. It was mentioned that these regulations will need 6 people to be employed. As I've said, they are already employed. They're employed because we have a housing and nuisance team. Housing and nuisance team is supposed to deal with lots of different issues to do with housing. And the issue we have is that they cannot do that job efficiently and effectively. And I've outlined some of the reasons for that, and I may come back to that. I would say as well that there was a slightly disturbing tendency to blame other people for the situation where we're bringing forward these regulations. It's the tenant's fault for not pursuing complaints. Why don't they complain? Why not have an anonymous phone line? So the problem is not that people do not know where to go. They do know where to go. They do go to people. They come to us and they come to others. The problem is enforcement. So why do we not enforce when we get told about these properties? So we have to live in the real world, and in the real world we have to deal with people's lives, and we have to make flexible and proportionate decisions. It brought to mind an experience of mine from my days on Newsnight, if I may travel back that far. And the one time that I saw Jeremy Paxman significantly discomforted was when we had a mad idea of getting some unemployed people onto the show instead of politicians. Jeremy Paxman then interviewed them in connection with their predicaments and why they weren't taking advantage of laws that could help them and why they weren't applying for the full benefits that they could have and so on. And it was the one time, as I say, I saw Jeremy kind of quite discomforted because he was used to a world of structure and order, in which ministers have the information to hand. There are laws, there are clearly briefings that people follow. These people were chaotic. They did not have the laws to hand. They didn't fully understand their rights and responsibilities and so on. But they were passionate. And that threw him a little bit. And that was very interesting. And I think it reminds me that in the real world, we have to deal with complexity, we have to deal with people in difficult circumstances, and we have to make proportionate decisions based on those situations. So when it comes to enforcing, when we get told about properties, we get a call from somebody who says they're living in unsafe accommodation. We have to deal with that very sensitively. And if people ask for us to, as a condition for them telling us more about that situation, if they make a condition of that we would not take action, then we have to make a difficult decision. Do we say, no, I'm sorry, in that case, if you won't give us your name and the address of your property, we don't want to hear about it. Put the phone down, sorry, we're not interested. Or do we say, okay, that's not ideal, perhaps we can persuade you later, but the best thing to do in this situation is to agree, okay, we understand you're worried about this, so we won't contact the landlord, but we will come and look at your property, make a report, and so on. So I wonder which of those two things members would rather we did. The other sort of red herring that was slightly thrown at us is this idea that the legislation as it's written contains enormous scope for the minister to act arbitrarily, and so on. One of the examples cited, and I know the landlords have cited this, is that there's an element in the order that says that I can impose conditions to licenses that I see fit. Yeah. That is designed very specifically to enable us to do conditional licenses. In other words, it is designed so that we can say, you have a license, but the license conditions are not currently being met, therefore we need to improve those conditions. Here are the conditions that we put on your license. You can keep the license so long as this is done. It's not a draconian, excessive, arbitrary power. It is a tightly defined thing designed to make sure that we have a flexible tool to respond to poor conditions. It means that we can respond without having to say, close the property down, leave the property. We can say, here's a set of conditions that need to be met within a specified time frame after discussion with the landlord to make sure that it's reasonable to achieve them in that time frame. That is what that supposedly excessive clause is there for. It's a red herring. Also was raised the idea that we might have excessive, sort of nitpicking thing, small damp patch, steep staircase, that kind of thing. Well, I think that's a misunderstanding, as I hope I made clear, of the way we enforce. We're not there to do that sort of thing. No officers are there to do that sort of thing. There's no point in doing that sort of thing because it means we don't tackle the real problem. The real problem is what we want to tackle. I've made that very clear to officers, but actually I don't have to because they're not in the business of doing that sort of thing. They've got a heavy workload. They're not going to waste their time on that sort of thing. It's pointless. What we do is help landlords to achieve compliance. That's the meaning of the techniques that I said, and I wrote them down to repeat them. Engage, explain, encourage, and enforce. That is the meaning of doing it that way. The question was raised about the draft application form and all the terrible things that it might involve. There isn't a draft application form at the moment. That would mean that we would have, I think, exceeded our authority. We do not have a licensing scheme yet. Were we to spend time on something that may not be enacted, I think the Assembly might well take a view on that. So no, it doesn't exist. But the regulations give pretty clear guidance about what's going to be required in it. It's pretty basic information. It's to do with who owns or looks after the property, what the address is, and so on. It's not a long list of other things. It's there to ensure we can enforce against the law, that's all. So, revenge eviction. Let's deal with this question of revenge eviction, as several people have talked about this. Indeed, revenge eviction is not allowed, or would not be allowed if it were to be proven that there was something like that. But the point about eviction is that, as several members have said, is that it is entirely lawful to evict people simply by not renewing their tenancy. That is what people fear. Now, it might be in revenge, it might not. It's irrelevant what it's called. The fact is that the power exists, tenants know it exists, and they are fearful of its use in that context. So I think we do need a bespoke law. In fact, I find it rather odd that this is one of the few cases I've seen where politicians are arguing that they would rather we had a difficult to enforce law. They'd rather that there were a few obstacles in the way that we tried to work around, rather than have a simple, bespoke law that addresses the issue directly. This is about doing the job well, because that is what tenants deserve. Deputy Luce, I would like to say thank you to him for notifying me in advance that he would be calling this in. And of course, I respect the right of scrutiny to examine the regulations in detail. And in fact, I welcome the chance to explain the proposals and deal with the detailed issues that maybe arise. Deputy Scott mentioned lodging houses. Lodging houses are covered by separate legislation. I'm not a fan of regulation for its own sake, and the idea that we would impose a new set of regulations on licensing on lodging houses in addition to the existing set does not strike me as sensible, so they are excluded. So the question of a register versus a license. Deputy Tadia, I think, made this point well. A register is simply a list. You don't have any conditions attached to a register, you simply fill it in. It's like when you go to school, you fill in the register. The register is there, you don't do anything with it, it's simply a record. We do not, that gets us, as I said in my speech, halfway there. It doesn't get us to the flexible enforcement tool that we need. Deputy Alex Curtis made a plea for the processes involved to be as simple as we possibly can. And I would second that. That has been my intention throughout this. It is to try and make it as light touch as possible. I do not believe in regulation for the sake of it. I join Deputy Gorst in saying that. I join fellow ministers in saying that. We need it to be proportionate. I have come to the view that this is the best way of enforcing the law that we have. Deputy Andrews raised the issue of whether we couldn't gather together the data that we need from other sources. As I say, data scraping from lots of other sources, it seems to me to be an odd way to go about things, to say that if you tried really hard to get information from lots of different sources, overcame data protection issues, which probably actually would be insurmountable, if you jumped through lots of hoops, found something through the control of home housing and work law, but it hasn't been updated, never mind, maybe we'll find a workaround for that somewhere. We could go through all those hoops, all those difficult things to try and achieve something which can be achieved by the very simple expedient of having a licensing system which requires one form to be filled in every 2 years with some very basic information. Constable Jackson referred to Andium, and yes, Andium is included. He suggested that maybe it shouldn't. I said earlier that I believe that government should regulate itself just as rigorously as the private sector. I stand by that principle. We cannot give exclusions to our own organisations. It would be totally unfair to the private sector that would have to meet these standards and be subject to a form of regulation that was not applied to our own organisations. It would also be very difficult to exclude Andium and not include other, we'd have to then consider excluding other social housing providers. I've met with all the social housing, I think I've met with all the social housing providers, certainly met with Andium and with one other. Maybe there was one that didn't come. But they understand this. I wouldn't say anybody is delighted at the thought that they have to pay £30 a year, but they accept the reasons for it. And I would say that it is tempting to argue that Andium are a good landlord. We know they are a good landlord. We know they try very hard, but I cannot guarantee that every Andium property is going to be safe under these rules. And so I think it is fair that they be included. Deputy Howell asked what will happen if officers are too officious. What happens if there is a regulatory failure? What happens if there is an unfair verdict against a landlord, for example? One of the changes I made to the scheme, at the request actually of the Jersey Landlords Association who raised this issue, they raised the point that under the previous schemes, the only appeal possible against a decision by an officer to remove a licence was judicial review. It was to go to the full court, which is an expensive and onerous step. So I have introduced a different appeal route which comes to the Minister. That means that the first port of call can be an appeal to the Minister. In the future, as the Housing Minister says, depending on where we get to with future legislation, maybe that rule could be amended and it could go to a housing tribunal. That is for the future, depends on where we get to with that legislation. And of course, there's also the Complaints Board as well. And none of that removes the final right of appeal, which remains to the court through judicial review. So there are mechanisms to hold officers to account. I would take very strong issue, I'm afraid, with Deputy Howell's comment that no proper consultation has been had with landlords. I'm afraid that is wrong. I have had several meetings, many meetings with the JLA. I held a public meeting, somewhat notoriously, and I have listened to arguments. I've spoken on the phone to the Landlords Association. I have answered email questions from the Landlords Association. I struggle to see that I could have done more in terms of engaging with the Landlords Association. And as Deputy Mezek said, there has indeed been a long history of consultation. I have here the consultation that accompanied the previous attempt to get this through the Assembly. That includes all the public consultation that was undertaken. And Deputy Howell also talked about a section of our community is making known that they don't like this and they feel demonised. Well, we're not here to demonise landlords. And the key determinant of that is we are not going to be inspecting every property. We do not need to inspect every property. We do not want to inspect every property. For most landlords, the engagement with these regulations will be filling in the form and paying the fee. The purpose of these regulations is to give us the tools to respond flexibly and efficiently in a targeted manner. But we do need that licensing system in order to have the ability to focus, to encourage people to come forward so that we can focus inspections where they're needed. Deputy Ayer mentioned that a previous scheme had come down from 5 years to 2 years. Well, as Deputy Mezek said, there's actually been lots of versions of this, 1 year, 2 years, 5 years. My view was 2 years, not 1 year, because that feels excessive, that your property is probably unlikely to have deteriorated hugely. In the course of a year, it might, but we've got to be proportional about this. 5 years, on the other hand, I think there could be a significant deterioration in a property in 5 years. And therefore, I think it is reasonable to say that's too long. 2 years seems to me to strike a reasonable balance. I don't expect everyone will agree with it, but it's not been unthought through. It has been, Deputy Ayer also said that we should not, that the fee should not have been in there because noted that the previous version was free, was marketed as being free. I did look at the debate notes on the previous debate on this when there was that proposition that these should be free, the licence should be free. There was widespread scepticism in the Assembly that free really meant free. There was a general view, I think, that the Minister was only saying in order to get it through, and once it was through, then fees would be introduced. I took the view that I would be honest, upfront, and straightforward about fees. I believe that the fees should be, the cost of this should be borne by landlords, not by the general taxpayer. That is in accordance with our general principle in the island, widely followed in lots of areas where user pays. But I wanted to make sure that those fees were defined in some way that was understandable. They weren't just, it wasn't just a random figure plucked from the air. So I asked officers to calculate the rough cost of the 6 full-time equivalent staff who will be looking at this. And that is where the fee was derived from. And I've also, as I've said, committed to the fact that I will not raise it by more than inflation. And there is a clearly understandable basis on which I have come up with that figure. I can't tie the hands of future ministers, no Assembly can, but I'm attempting to put as much friction in the system as possible by tying my own hands. Deputy Gorst, I agree, we should not be divided. That is why I've gone out of my way to consult with landlords. We need landlords, and we need in particular good landlords. And Deputy Gorst mentioned the word encourage rather than enforce. Of course, in my scheme of enforcement, we have both. Engage, explain, encourage, and enforce. In that order. Of course, we would much rather encourage than enforce. Enforce is an absolute last resort. Nobody wants to go down that route. So I'll make concluding remarks, I think. I've dealt, I hope, with as many points as I could there. So, as Deputy Gorst pointed out, this is a debate on the principles contained within the proposition. And I believe it is really quite a simple issue. Most landlords are renting out perfectly good properties and take pride in doing so. They have nothing whatsoever to fear from this proposition. And indeed, I have been contacted privately by many landlords who are supportive of these proposals. They know that poor quality properties undercut in price are well-managed properties that they are putting on the market. But we do have a significant, well-evidenced problem with unsafe housing conditions. In general, we are keen to have efficient and effective government. Yet, as I've remarked in my earlier comments, we are here asking for all sorts of convoluted measures, scraping data from elsewhere, trying to find ways of inspecting properties when we don't know where they are, anything to avoid an efficient, light-touch system for enforcing the law. And en passant, I'll deal with Deputy Scott's argument that indeed we can already do random inspections. We can. But we can't in practice. The law allows us to, but we can't in practice because we don't know where the rented properties are. We would have to go knocking on doors. We wouldn't know whether we were knocking on the private rented house, an Andium house, other social house, or indeed a home owner occupied. We do not have the information. I would say to members, play the ball in front of you. It's all, the criticisms that I've heard have all been about what will happen in the future, which, you know, the possibilities for this in the end turning into something worse, becoming a bigger monster than it currently is. Which seems to suggest to me that people do accept that the proposal as put forward is not actually that excessive. I am committed to this being light touch regulation. But I do have a legal duty to ensure that we have safe recommended rental dwellings, and I am committed to that. This is a proportionate, efficient, effective method of enforcing the rules that already exist. I listened carefully to all the speeches, and not one person challenged the idea that licensing will work, as I pointed out in my original speech. No one argues that this will work. It is only about whether it is proportionate and whether it is excessive. And I think I have made a case to say that it is not out of proportion. So I think we have an opportunity here to do something for some of the most vulnerable people in our society. Not always the most vulnerable people, actually, as Deputy Wilson said. But we have the opportunity to do something with a relatively light touch that will make people's lives better in this island and at a relatively low cost. I do not say no cost. I understand that this imposes a cost on landlords, but it is a very small cost when set against the potential benefits. So, sir, I urge members to support this proposition and I call for the appel.
Minister, the appel has been called for. Members are invited to return to their seats. I ask the greffier to open the voting. 4 members have had the chance to cast their votes. Ask the greffier to close the voting. Greffier, were there any remotely cast votes? And I can announce that the regulations have in principle been adopted, 34 votes for and 10 votes contra.
We have the conch, please, sir.
Yes.
Those members voting contre, the Conotab of St Brelard, Trinity and St Juan, and deputies Lahigara, Ayer, Balash, Scott, Howell, Ferry and Barbara Ward.
Deputy Ward, Deputy Luce, your panel wishes to scrutinise this matter.
Yes, sir. I
Do you
believe
have a date?
the date would be the November the 7th, but we will do everything we can to get here before that date.
Yes.
Sir, may I make a small comment in relation to that? Which,
yes, you may.
Because of that, I do want to just make a clarification in terms of dates that apply. The regulations suggest that the licensing system will come in on January the 1st. Given that we may be debating this in November, with the possibility for amendments and the uncertainty that that brings, I think it is unreasonable to try and bring it in January, and I would not propose to bring this in before May. May would be the earliest date. I want to say that now so that landlords understand that there won't be a sudden, and indeed tenants understand that there won't be a sudden scramble following a debate in November to try and bring this in. There will be the same gap between the vote and the bringing in as there would have been had we gone through the whole system today.
Thank you, Minister. Members are content that the matter returns on the 7th of November. Yes, the next item is the draft Proceedings of Crime, Financial Intelligence Commencement Amendment Regulations, B43, Proceeds of Crime, lodged by the Chief Minister. I ask the greffier to read the proposition.
Draft Proceeds of Crime, Financial Intelligence Commencement of Amendment Regulations, Jersey Act 2000. The states make this act under Regulation 12 of the Proceeds of Crime, Financial Intelligence Amendment Jersey Regulations 2022.
Deputy Miller, your rapporteur for this.
Thank you, sir. I will begin by assuring members that there will be no parrots, dogs or jokes in this speech. Certainly no parrots. Sir, this Act, if adopted, will bring into force the Proceeds of Crime, Financial Intelligence Amendment Jersey Regulations 2022, which were passed by this Assembly on 31st March 2022. For the benefit of members who were not part of that Assembly, I will give a little background. As I've already mentioned earlier today, the island's preparations are continuing for the upcoming Moneyval assessment. A key part of those preparations involves improving the structure and governance of the Financial Intelligence Unit, or FIU, in order to satisfy both the technical requirements of the FATF standards, the 40 recommendations, and the effectiveness assessment known as the 11 immediate outcomes. To meet those standards, the FIU is required to be an organisation in Jersey which is responsible for the receipt, analysis and dissemination of financial intelligence for the purpose of detecting and preventing financial crime. In Jersey's last Moneyval report in 2015, Moneyval raised concerns about the operational independence of the FIU. These concerns centred around the fact that the FIU is a subunit of the Joint Financial Crime Unit, which is itself a part of the States of Jersey Police Force. In 2016, the Joint Financial Crime Unit was split into two defined areas of work to appropriately firewall the Financial Intelligence Unit function from the operational investigation function. In 2019, the FIU underwent an increase in resources which saw almost all posts formerly held by police officers move to civilian police staff. it was recognised that the need for all posts to be held by sworn police officers was no longer needed for most of its work. However, a detective sergeant remained as a sole police officer based within the FIU. The need to retain a police officer within the unit was driven by the requirements of the Proceeds of Crime Jersey Law 1999, which requires a police officer to withhold consent to transact financial services business. In June 2021, Jersey conducted a strategic review of its compliance with the FATF standards. This review outlined further areas of improvement required to the structure and governance of the FIU to ensure it was compliant with the FATF standards. This was despite the incremental changes made since the 2015 assessment. In December 2021, the government's Financial Crime Political Steering Group, made up of all agencies concerned in financial crime prevention in the island, recommended that the Minister move forward with lodging an amendment to the Proceeds of Crime Financial Intelligence Jersey Regulations 2015 to contain provisions which would seek to address the major areas of improvement required to bring Jersey in line with international standards. This recommendation was accepted, and on 31st March 2022, those amendment regulations were passed by the States Assembly under the last government. The key provisions of those regulations are that they set out clearly the autonomous nature and functions of the FIU. The regulations move the oversight, accountability and reporting chain from the Chief of Police to the FIU Governance Board. They create a directly appointed director of the FIU. They remove the requirement for warranted officers to be part of the FIU in order to exercise its functions. And they remove the requirement for the Attorney-General to give consent to share financial intelligence. In order to complete the current stage of the process of bringing the FIU further into line with international standards, I am now requesting that the States agree to adopt this Appointed Day Act to bring the 22 regulations into force. Thank you, sir.
Thank you, Minister. Is the draft act seconded?
It is, sir.
Does any member wish to speak on the draft act? Those members in favour, please kindly show. Thank you. The act is adopted. Next item is the States of Jersey Development Company Limited reappointment of a non-executive director lodged by the Minister for Treasury and Resources, P43. I ask the greffier to read the proposition.
The States are asked to decide whether they are of opinion, A, to reappoint Nicholas Windsor MBE as a non-executive director of the States of Jersey Development Company Limited for a further period of up to 3 years in accordance with the Memorandum and Articles of Association to take effect from the delivery to the company of the notice referred to in paragraph B below. And B, to authorise the greffier of the States for and on behalf of the States to deliver a notice to the States of Jersey Development Company Limited in accordance with Article 21B of the Memorandum and Articles of Association to give effect to such appointment.
Minister.
Thank you, sir. As members know, the States of Jersey Development Company was established in 2010, and this proposition recommends to the Assembly that one director remain on its board, ensuring continuity of experience and knowledge. Members will be aware in 2020 the Assembly approved updated Articles of Association of the company. These included the provision that non-executive directors can serve for periods of up to 3 years rather than fixed terms of 3 years to facilitate effective succession planning. And I'm proposing that the Assembly approve the reappointment of Nick Windsor for a second term of up to 3 years. Members can see from the proposition that Mr. Windsor comes highly recommended. He's got good experience in UK corporate governance. He's got good experience in the world of financing and banking, and he has proved himself to be a valuable member of the board.
Thank you, Minister. Is the proposition seconded?
Yes, sir.
Thank you. Does any member wish to speak on the proposition? Yes, Deputy Feltham.
Thank you, sir. And firstly, I'd like to say that I make no comment as to the person that we would be appointing today. What I would like to say is that the Jersey Development Company and who it is there to serve is something that comes up quite often as a matter of discussion within this chamber. And I did find it interesting that the report doesn't seek to give us any confidence as to the performance of the structure of the board itself, and also how the Minister is assured that his nominee does represent the interests of both the Minister and the general public. So I stand today not in opposition of this particular proposition, but to put the Minister on notice that I will want to seek some further clarification about whether this structure of the board is actually working in the best interests of the general public. I note that this proposition would see the appointment being for up to 3 years. I would seek to get some further clarification and potentially bring a proposition if required, and if we can see that actually it would be in the best interests for the board to have a States member, an elected member, to represent the public interests. If we need to do that. But I would like to seek further evidence from the Minister in due course about whether the islanders' best interests are indeed being served by the current makeup of the board.
Thank you, Deputy. Does any other wish to speak on the proposition?
Thank you, sir. The first question I have regards the financial and manpower implications. Because it says there are no financial or manpower implications for the states arising from this, and I know the argument may be made that the money for the remuneration has been allocated, therefore the states don't need to pay any more money for that. But presumably, if we are to have a choice today, and in the hypothetical situation that this proposition were rejected, then any remuneration that the non-executive director would be receiving obviously wouldn't get paid to him, and therefore there would be a financial and manpower implication somewhere along the line, at least for the States of Jersey Development Company. They would have money that they didn't have before, and it may well be that the states wouldn't need to give them so much money in future if indeed we ever did need to give them money. So there is an indirect hypothetical financial and manpower implication there, even if it's not a direct one for the States Assembly. I think it would be helpful with that in mind for the Treasury Minister to remind us exactly how much this individual will be getting paid, how much he got paid last year, including any bonuses, and what the bonuses were for, if he did get them. Now similarly to the comments from Deputy Feltham, my comments are not about the individual. I'm sure looking at the black and white, he's got some very good credentials there. But I'm in a difficult position here because I fundamentally have grave concerns about the raison d'etre of the States of Jersey Development Company and the way it's currently operating, not just the composition of the board. And so I don't know how I can vote to appoint somebody to an entity that I don't have confidence in. So I'm unlikely to support this proposition today, and I think it's important that I put on record that I wouldn't want the individual in question whom I don't know and whom I'm therefore indifferent to as such, to take that as any personal slight, but simply to say that I don't have confidence in the States of Jersey Development Company as an entity in the current way it's been run.
Thank you, Deputy. Conatap, Arson Brallard, and then Deputy Balash. Conatap, Arson Brallard.
Thank you, sir. Would the Treasury Minister, in summing up, just outline whether he agrees that non-executive directors of SOJDC should be receiving bonuses if the company is making a loss? Thank you, sir.
Thank you, Conatap. Deputy Balash.
So a number of members might share the views of Deputy Tadier in relation to the performance of the States of Jersey Development Company, but that seems to me to have absolutely nothing whatever to do with the proposition which is before the Assembly today. And I feel rather uncomfortable, sir, that the proposition is actually before the Assembly. I thought that there was a resolution of the Assembly which had agreed that we would not, with one or two exceptions, be debating in public the suitability of individuals, distinguished individuals in this case, for appointment to particular boards of companies. And I wonder if the Minister would undertake to take that thought away with him and to give some consideration as to whether the Articles of Association of Jersey Development Company might be changed so as to make it possible for directors of the company to be appointed by the Minister himself. That does not take away the right of members of this Assembly to question the functions of the Jersey Development Company, but that's an entirely different issue. And I hope that the Minister might be able to respond.
Thank you, Deputy. Conrad Harbison-Hellier.
Thank you, sir. You've already given a certain amount of latitude to speakers on this, as has been observed by the previous speaker, and I do want to be placed on the record as saying that I have confidence in the Jersey Development Company, and therefore I don't agree with Deputy Tadier at all. If I might very briefly allude to the fact, and I've said this before in the Assembly, that the Jersey College for Girls building stood dilapidated and unused for 15 years before this group got things done there and had it turned into housing of all sorts. And meanwhile, a surface car park at the Esplanade Quarter has been turned into what I believe is an extremely well-made international finance centre with copious amounts of open space, a new civic square, and possibly the provision on the rest of the site of important civic facilities such as a National Gallery for Jersey. So I have confidence in what they're doing, and I am fully backing this latest reappointment of a director to the group. Thank you, sir.
Yes, well, perhaps slightly running away with the contents of the proposition. Deputy Mezek.
Well, let's see how we go, sir. I simply wanted to say on record that the Constable of St Helier certainly does not speak for all of his parishioners in making that totally uncritical view of the role that that company has had in our parish in providing homes, for example, on the waterfront that are of a totally inadequate standard to Jersey's housing need, for the fact that it does not make much of a profit in any year, and in any event has provided in its entire existence a lower return than Andiam Homes manages to provide to the States every single year. It's a broken model, and if I can somehow make this relevant to proposition, sir, I'll say that I hope that this particular appointee may be able to improve the quality of decision-making of that company in future, but the Constable of St Helier does not speak for all of his parishioners there.
Thank you, Deputy Mezek. I call upon the Minister to reply. Minister.
Thank you, sir. Perhaps if I could actually just start with Deputy Feltham. And I understand her intervention, and I welcome facilitating that conversation because it is the Waterfront Enterprise Board, then replaced by SOJDC, has not been universally loved by politicians for all sorts of reasons. I think it is a fair and reasonable analysis would be that under the current leadership, SOJDC has made great improvements from what was there before and provided lots of public benefit. But we remind ourselves they were, unlike Andiam, created to make profits, to reinvest in infrastructure around St Helier. What I sense from some of the interventions is that that is being questioned by members. That's no problem with members questioning that, and I'm quite happy to facilitate those conversations around where is the public good in the work that the SOJDC do? I sit, of course, much more on the side of the Constable of St Helier, but equally I do think that SOJDC can help the Housing Minister in dealing with the affordability issue, but that's not part of this proposition. I have confidence in Mr Windsor. Those members that know him as an individual know that he is, although no longer living here in Jersey, is passionate about Jersey, contributes to the not-for-profit sector in Jersey, and has moved some of those organisations forward and supported them and unlocked things which others may not have done for those charities. But he also understands the property market and he understands financing of property, and I've got no hesitation in seeking for him to be continue for up to a further 3 years. With regard to the point that Deputy Balash raised, he is right. There was an in-principle decision a number of years ago to remove directors of arm's-length bodies from approval by the states. Between that in-principle decision and the enactment thereof in practice, it won't surprise me to know that members of the day made some adjustments so that not all of those were removed. But I think he's right, because this conversation should not in any way, to my mind, be taken as being critical of the individual, because I don't think anyone has been. Perhaps Deputy Tadeo was trying to get there, but withheld himself. The remuneration for non-executive directors of SOJDC is £22,000 a year. As members know, non-executive directors don't get bonuses. There are bonus schemes in some of the arm's length organisations, and I perhaps have a view on how those schemes are working and whether they are the benchmarks that are used are appropriate, or whether over time, as sometimes happens, these organisations end up having bonuses which don't have enough flex in them, and really sometimes non-executives can receive bonuses for, in effect, doing their day job. And so we are doing a review of that to make sure that any bonuses really are flex, and really are, they've gone above and beyond and done more than either the Minister or this Assembly expects of them. Members will know that one of the arm's length organisations recently did make a loss, and bonuses, rightly in my view, were not paid. But it is something which we are continuing to review, and we expect restraint in all of these matters, because the trust of the public and the trust of this Assembly is very important in ensuring that these organisations can carry out the functions for which they were initially created. And having veered off the proposition but onto the comments of members, I hope that they will support this reappointment. So thank you.
Thank you, Minister. Is the appel called for?
If I may, sir, thank you.
Appel has been called for. I invite members to return to their seats and the greffier to open the voting. Four members have had the opportunity of casting their votes. I ask the greffier to close the voting. Any remote votes? I can announce that the proposition has been adopted. 35 votes pour, 2 votes contre, and 2 abstentions. Yes.
Those members voting contre, the Connaught Harbour, St Bellard and Deputy Tadier. Those members who abstained, Deputy Rose Binet and Deputy Howe.
The next item is whistleblowing, introduction of legislation lodged by Deputy Alves. The main respondent is the Chief Minister. Deputy Alves, there's an amendment lodged by the Minister for Social Security. Do you accept the amendment?
I do so, yes.
Do you wish your proposition to be read as amended?
Yes, please, sir.
Are members content for the proposition to be read as amended? Thank you very much. Yes, please, Graffier.
The states are asked to decide whether they are of opinion to agree that whistleblowing legislation should be introduced and to request the Minister for Social Security, in consultation with the Council of Ministers, to bring forward the necessary legislation for approval by the Assembly prior to the end of December 2024.
Deputy Alves.
Thank you, sir. The protection of whistleblowers is crucial to the health of our democracy and the well-being of our society. Currently, whistleblowers in our island face significant risks and barriers when attempting to expose wrongdoings. Over the years, we've seen a number of reports of whistleblowers in our local media who have felt they had no choice but to do it through the media anonymously due to fear of reprisal. Whistleblowers play a vital role in the fight for a fairer world, exposing corruption, wrongdoing, and abuses of power that would otherwise remain hidden from public scrutiny. They provide an early warning system, alerting us to potential dangers that can harm our economy, public health, and the trust citizens place in our organisations. They shine a light on misconduct within government bodies, corporations, and institutes, holding those responsible accountable and ensuring that the truth prevails. They are the eyes and ears of our society, and by safeguarding their rights, we enhance our capacity to detect and prevent wrongdoing. However, it is a sad reality that these individuals often face severe repercussions for their actions. Critics may argue that whistleblower protection would impede the efficient functioning of organisations. However, I firmly believe that these concerns can be addressed through effective implementation. A balance must be struck that enables genuine whistleblowing while also protecting against malicious intent. Other countries have successfully implemented measures, and we can learn from their experiences and best practices. The United Kingdom first introduced legislation specifically focused on whistleblower protection with the enactment of the Public Interest Disclosure Act 1998. This law came into force on July the 2nd, 1999. It was designed to provide legal protection to individuals who disclose information about wrongdoing in the workplace, ensuring they are safeguarded from unfair treatment or dismissal as a result of their disclosures. The law marked a significant step towards recognising and protecting the rights of whistleblowers in the UK. So, sir, it is high time that we too, almost 25 years later, acknowledge the invaluable contributions of whistleblowers and ask that comprehensive legislation is brought forward to safeguard their rights. In summary, whistleblower legislation is important because it facilitates the exposure of wrongdoing, protects the public interest, promotes transparency and accountability, enables prevention and early detection, fosters ethical workplace environments, and deters retaliation. By providing legal protection for whistleblowers, we can ensure a fair and just environment where the truth and integrity are upheld in our society. So, sir, I hope that members will support this proposition, and I thank the Social Security Minister and the Council of Ministers for their supportive amendment. I make the proposition. Thank you, sir.
Thank you, Deputy. Is the proposition seconded? Yes, sir. Does any member wish to speak on the proposition? Minister.
Thank you, sir. I'm grateful to Deputy Alves for agreeing to accept my amendment. It seeks only to introduce a realistic timetable for the work to be done. As the report attached to my amendment points out, developing, consulting on and completing work will require some resources, both policy and legislative, as well as input from the Employment Forum and wider interested parties, including existing regulatory bodies. With other competing ministerial priorities, completion by the end of 2024 is, in my view, a realistic alternative, giving us an extra 6 months from the Deputy's original proposition. I share with the Deputy a desire to explore the opportunity to ensure that Jersey's legislation includes appropriate safeguards for employees to be able to bring into the public domain issues of inappropriate or criminal conduct, whether it be in the public or private sector. In fact, sir, I remember as long ago as possibly it must have been 2001, being somewhat concerned as a director at a local bank, being asked to roll out a head office whistleblowing policy because we did not have the protections that already existed in the UK at that time. There are already, however, non-statutory whistleblowing schemes in operation in Jersey. The government operates a whistleblowing policy for public servants, and the Jersey Financial Services Commission has a dedicated whistleblowing hotline which it has put in place to help it identify regulatory misconduct. The Commission also recommends that financial services businesses should have a whistleblowing policy and procedure in place. Given the increasing significance attached to whistleblowing in many other jurisdictions and potential impacts on a whistleblower, particularly in a small jurisdiction, it's entirely appropriate for work to be done to scope out the kind of whistleblowing arrangements and employment protections that might be appropriate for Jersey, and I commend the amended proposition to the Assembly. Thank you.
Thank you, Minister. Does any other member speak on the proposition? Deputy Jean.
Thank you, sir. Whistleblowers have an important role in safeguarding the public good, and this is repeatedly proven by the scandals that they have uncovered, such as the industry-scale tax avoidance of LuxLeaks and Panama Papers, or the money laundering of Danske Bank and Danske Bank scandal. But looked another way, there have been huge scandals that have occurred at very large corporate companies, scandals that could have been prevented with the help of whistleblowing, such as the Volkswagen Dieselgate, Facebook and Cambridge Analytica and Enron, that have proved very costly for these corporations, employees and the environment. If employees had felt confident to raise concerns, maybe these practices would have stopped much earlier on and saved huge amounts of money, job losses and negative effects on the environment. It is important to remember that many irregularities, that could have been major scandals do not happen because someone has dared to speak out, often at great personal risk. So ultimately, societies, institutions and citizens lose out when there is no one willing to cry foul in the face of corruption. But the three main reasons people give for not reporting corruption are fear of the consequences, whether legal, financial or reputational, the belief that nothing will be done, that it will not make any difference, or uncertainty about how, where and to whom to report. These reasons should be kept in mind when developing whistleblowing legislation. Addressing these concerns should be at the heart of any legislation proposal if it is to achieve its objective. Effectively protect whistleblowers so that more people who are aware of wrongdoing speak up, facilitating these wrongdoings to be tackled and any harm to the public interest prevented or stopped. The right of citizens to report wrongdoing is part of the right of freedom of expression and is linked to the principles of transparency and integrity. Therefore, I support this proposition.
Deputy. Conatarbus and Brillard.
Thank you, sir. I just, whilst I wouldn't condone impropriety in banks or large institutions in any shape or form, I would just counsel care that any proposed legislation changes doesn't have any effect on the smaller businesses who could ill afford to have to comply with disproportionate regulation which may come to the table. Thank you, sir.
Thank you, Conatar. Deputy Ferry.
Thank you, sir. Jurisdictions around the world are increasingly recognising the need for employees to be able to make protected disclosures when they see what they believe is wrongdoing by an employer. Employees in such situations need to have the confidence to report wrongdoing, and this means creating legal protections for them to do so, whether that be specific legislation aimed at protecting whistleblowers or amendments to Jersey's existing employment legislation. A key factor in any new legislation will be the protection of an employee from retaliation by an employer for whistleblowing by dismissal or demotion. Jersey's international reputation is a key driver for our economy, enabling a process where light can be shone on unacceptable practices can only be a good thing for the island's reputation in the longer term. Deputy Alves is right. The issue is complex and will need considerable time and resources to get the right outcome. For this reason, I support the amended proposition and urge the Assembly to do so as well, sir.
Thank you, Deputy. Does any other member wish to speak on the proposition? I call upon Deputy Alves to reply.
Thank you, sir. And I'd like to thank all members for their contributions and words of support. And I think the Constable of St Brelard raised a valid concern, which I hope that the government will take on board his comments before bringing back the legislation at the end of next year. And with that, sir, I maintain the proposition and a call for the appel. Thank you.
Thank you. The appel has been called for. Members are invited to return to their seats. I'll ask the greffier to open the voting. All members have the opportunity of casting their votes. I'll ask the greffier to close the voting. And I can announce the proposition has been adopted unanimously, 42 votes for.
Sir, can I propose the adjournment?
Any member wish to speak on the adjournment? Adjournment's proposed. The Assembly stands adjourned until 9:30 tomorrow morning.